Oscar and Penelope were married a long time ago, over 10 years ago. From the outside, they seemed to be an ideal family with 3 children. Husband, a successful businessman. Wife, the ideal hostess and mother. An honor student son. 2 twin girls, beauties. What more could one want for happiness? About the true state of affairs knew only Penelope. Before marriage, she managed to get a good economic education. In addition, she knew that her vocation to do business. Succeeding in this, she was engaged in it. The prosperity of their family and the growth of her husband's company were mainly her merit. But all the praise went to Oscar, and the profits were in his hands. Penelope did not mind, did not want to lower her husband's self-esteem. She saw how happy and proud he was of his successes. And what is her prerogative? House and household, and the upbringing of the children, of course. True, even in this was not so simple. And her husband's attitude towards her achievements was not always happy. Oscar never wanted to have many children. So when the eldest son Morgan was born, he was sure that he would stop there. But Penelope really dreamed of a daughter. When she told her husband about it, he dismissed it. And when she told him she was expecting her second, he was extremely unhappy. Do or what? Nothing to do. With one is only a hassle. You need a second, he grumbled. But Oscar, it will be a girl. I'm sure you'll see how happy it is to have a daughter. Yes, all men dream of a daughter, rejoiced Penelope. Someone maybe in dreams, but I, for example, I dream in the evenings after work to relax and not listen to children's cries, he wrinkled. What screams? Very soon the child will grow up, and there will be no more screams, only joy. I can imagine these joys, especially when the girl grows up and starts to go out with gentlemen. Oh well, what can I do? You cannot argue with you, said the husband unhappily. And Penelope fulfilled his dream as not just, and even with excess, gave birth to twins. Husband, meeting her from the hospital, congratulated, and even praised, well done, you've got me. For whatever you undertake, and all the return is double. Well, at least such praise. True, in general, her husband did not spoil her with kind words. On the contrary, and considered himself, and others made it clear that his wife is unspeakably lucky with him. Lives on everything ready-made, no worries, do not know. Why? After all business matters have to decide he, a man, the father of the family. Penelope did not argue, uncomplainingly dealt with the documents brought home, in which the husband did not understand anything. During working hours, sometimes she even annoyed at him. I do not understand what you then at work. If such a simple question could not solve, she wondered and immediately received an answer. Easy for you to say at home. Maybe such a question is easy to solve. But at work you run so much that they will ask you how much is 2 times 2, and you do not know. I don't have time to go home. I need to rest. Do you have time? Take a look. And in the morning you pick up the finished documents, I say condescendingly. But good for you. I knew you'd figure it out in 5 minutes. Although there wasn't much to do there. Agree? Penelope sighed, agreed, and went to do their household chores. Over time, she increasingly clearer realized her family life is not as good as desired and as it is seen by others. Her husband increasingly neglected both her and the children. In their relationship, they began to have some kind of cooling. At first, Penelope habitually blamed herself. Probably, after all, I'd given too much to realize my superiority. So he takes offense, she thought, and tried to soften the situation. But it didn't work very well. Mainly because Oscar was getting farther and farther away. That he had a mistress, his wife did not realize for a long time. But she did. At first, Oscar thought that he was just due to his status of a young, beautiful companion, and it has nothing to do with his wife or family. He simply has a mistress, and it is normal. Penelope will not know about it, and those around him, if they do know, will only approve of this behavior. After all, he in no way oppresses his spouse, does not harm the family. Just meets with the young woman, that's all. But over time, this woman, Scarlett, completely captured his attention and heart, and was not averse to taking possession of his wallet. That is, she made it quite her own. Sometimes on dates, sometimes jokingly, and sometimes very seriously, she talked about it. Look, we've been together so long. Do you want to keep me as your mistress forever? Will you never leave your many children? The kids will still be yours. You'll see them. Pay child support. Support them. Well, maybe you're right, Oscar replied thoughtfully. I'm sure you're right. But, it would be a big disadvantage for his reputation. He's left his wife with 3 children. Such a thing may not be forgiven in our circles. Oh, don't be silly. It's not the old days people leave their families and feel fine. No one condemns anyone, especially since everyone will see who you left her for. Admit it, I look much better than your wife. But you're entitled to your status. Young, beautiful, and the current wife let her live, quietly bring up your children. No one's forbidding it. Oh, Scarlett, don't talk about what you don't understand, Oscar dared to say one day. It's not about children, not in conscience, not in reputation in business. She Penelope, although officially and does not work with me, but something in this business understands. And I have a lot of things tied to her. What do you mean? Even from me, your mistress. Are you saying your business is really hers? No, he laughed, of course not. The business is mine. There's nothing to talk about. It's just that she knows a little something about it, too, and she helps me with things sometimes. I'm used to it. I don't often have time for the little things myself. So I just leave some things to her. Not very important, but still necessary operations she does well. And if we get divorced, I won't have that kind of help. I mean, you wouldn't be able to run the business. No, I'm not meant for that, Scarlett answered capriciously. But I'm sure you say that because you don't love me and you're not going to leave your wife. Are you just deceiving me? Are you using me? No, I'm not. But what I'm telling you is that my relationship with my wife is purely business, and she knows it. So you're telling me you don't know anything about business and you can't make a move without her? Do you go to my place with her permission too? What are you talking about? What's wrong with you today? What's wrong with me is that you won't do anything for me. So you can gaze ingressed and get out of my house. I don't need that kind of lover. I need a safe, secure life. And I'm sitting here like a fool waiting for you. And I'm satisfied with some trifling gifts. But Scarlett, they ain't nothing. And then someday, well, maybe. When I retire, you'll be dead by then. I'm much younger than you, in case you've forgotten. That's it. That's it. That's it. If you don't want to live with me, you don't have to come at all. It's okay. Goodbye to you. I'll find Frank another reliable, confident man who won't give me up with some silly argument. You see, he doesn't know much about business. Yes, I understand everything, but it's a very difficult business indeed. Any fool is in business nowadays, and nobody's going out of business. And you, who's already got a very profitable business, suddenly you say you depend on your wife for everything. That's ridiculous. What's ridiculous? Business is complicated. Yeah, I bet if you gave half your business to any hobo off the street, he could handle it just as well as your beautiful wife. Oh, don't be silly. I'm sick of you calling me stupid so many times in one day. It's amazing. Of course, I'm always saying stupid things. I'm not as smart as this, your Penelope. And what's her name? She gave birth to 3 children and also runs your business while you're out with the ladies. How many of us do you have? Well, let me count. Well, I love only you. Okay, if you do, let's do an experiment. Let's give your business to some stranger and see if it's hard or not. It's no big deal. Even if it doesn't work out, your wife can fix it. You, of course, it is not possible. But Penelope's 7 inches in the forehead. Oscar at first took this conversation as a joke, but then he realized Scarlett meant it. Moreover, she has already agreed to break off the relationship if he refuses. But he wasn't ready to break up. You can't break up with someone like that. But so easily give his business, or even part of it, even for a while, for a month, in the hands of an unknown person, at the risk of losing everything. Naturally, he was not ready for that. On the other hand, Scarlett, though she really didn't know much about business, was right. An unskilled man is a good thing because he won't do much harm. It might even do him, Oscar, some good. And Scarlett, having lost this dispute, will calm down for a while, will stop threatening to break up. And then maybe he'll cool off a little. And maybe he'll find another beauty, more cooperative. There's been a lot of worrying going on. But with the damage that will cause John Doe some business, Penelope can easily cope. She really is a skillful, intelligent woman. There's nothing to be said for that. He always appreciated her business acumen. Only thought that to let her know about it is not necessary at all, or else it will be conceded. Putting part of your business in the wrong hands is not a good idea. Even with such good intentions, it's a little scary. I'll tell you that. But Scarlett just kept pushing. So are you scared? You realize I'm right? You, my dear, overestimated yourself, of course. Come on, enough of these jokes. It is your strangers do not have the guts to take away my business, said Oscar. And in the end, yielding to the persuasions of his mistress and his own desire for a little rest, he decided to accept Scarlett's proposal. Just where to get that first person was the only question that bothered him. Still with a sneer, he asked Scarlett the question. But the first one isn't the first one. That's what I said. You just have to take someone young, not yet down. Well, you don't want some dirty tramp in your firm, do you? Quite seriously, she said, businesslike. Of course I do. But where should I look for this decent tramp? Yes, there's a young guy who's been hanging around here for a while now. He looks all right. I thought of him right away, Scarlett said. And where did you meet this normal-looking hobo? Oscar frowned jealously. Oh, come on. He was changing a tire at my car. Don't think I'm going to get involved with any tramps. I just talked to him, too. I asked him how he was doing without a job and all that. But he doesn't look like the type. Wash him, change his clothes, he'd look like a human being. So you're going to take him as your replacement. Well, only if you patronize me. But watch out, if he messes up my case, you'll be responsible. I can be relentless, jokingly attacked her lover. And so, jokingly, he made a deed, which a reasonable man would hardly dare, transferred part of his business in the management of a completely unknown guy. It must be said that the latter did not agree immediately. At first, he didn't even believe that he was offered such a strange occupation. What kind of business is this? I've never run a business before. What do you have to do? Well, I understand you could be a security guard or, say, a courier. I could do that. You know, if it works out, I'll take you as a delivery boy or whatever you want. But right now, you have to play the big boss. After all, you're not stupid, convinced and businessman. Can you read right? No numbers and letters. That's all. And maybe my competitors will not like it so much, laughed Oscar. And he offered him a pretty good fee for a month of such work. Plus, he gave him money in advance to change his clothes, because it is necessary to portray a decent man in a decent form. All right, agreed the boy. I'll be a businessman for a while. But if something goes wrong, it's not my fault, and I won't be responsible for anything. You won't, don't worry. Nothing terrible will happen there. Oscar was really sure of it. Besides, he wanted a break from the routine. And Scarlett had convinced him to take a vacation for a week or two and go somewhere for a longer period of time. Oscar couldn't understand. He still had a wife to answer to. He told her that he was going on a business trip to meet with his partners. And strangely enough, she believed him. I mean, she took offense. How can you go at a time like this? You know, Morgan's going on vacation. I mean, we were all supposed to go on vacation together. And now it turns out you're going alone. but we'll go together later. It's just that there's a window at work right now. It's okay if I disappear for a week, and then I'll join you guys. Maybe, but I don't see any reason to be offended at all. I don't have vacations, and business is always business. Well, in general, Penelope, as always, understood everything, and he left with his mistress. Their Scarlet again began to be naughty. Why only for a week? Well, yes, I understand you're afraid for your business, and I have to accept it this time too. It's a lot worse to lose your business than it is to lose me. What am I to you? Some mistress, it's not hard to find another one. I do not know what else I have to do for you. Oscar waved his hands. Your rather strange request I fulfilled. I entrusted the business to someone unknown. How it is managed there now, no one knows. But I keep my promise. In case you've forgotten it, I said I wouldn't meddle in business for a month, so I won't. I just need to get home. We agreed. We're only going for a week. I don't know who you made a deal with. Look at the weather. But why can't we stay longer? Scarlet wouldn't let it go. Of course they could stay longer. But, first of all, Oscar knew not to make his wife too angry. And secondly, he was worried about his own business too. He was not going to interfere in the actions of the new manager, but still thought that at least from afar it was worth watching what was happening. When he returned home, he was surprised to see how things were going. The surprise was both pleasant and unpleasant at the same time. Things were going fine. But why? After all, he had left the business to a man who was practically a stranger, a vagrant, unprepared to deal with them. He started asking Scarlet questions. Look, what do you know about this young man? I don't think he's quite who he says he is. I told you, I don't know anything. Well, his name is Edward. He changed a tire on his car. That's good. That's all I know, she replied. He's very good at what he does. He obviously has some knowledge and experience. But I didn't check his diploma. I'm not a policeman nor a fortune teller. Maybe he has knowledge. Or maybe your whole business is such a piece of crap that any first grader could handle it. So you're just covering up your business so you can run away from your wife, May, too. Scarlet began to talk to him differently. Yes, and in general, he noticed that despite fulfilling all her whims, she clearly wanted to break off the relationship. And that would not be the greatest misfortune in his life. But Oscar finally noticed that the business was being taken away from him. And this was more serious. So serious that at one not very beautiful moment he realized that he simply, as they call it, circled around the finger. He no longer had any business, for the man to whom he had voluntarily handed it over, having signed all the papers, was not some Edward who could change tires on cars, but a man with a good and more than one economic education. And Scarlet was none other than Edward's mistress and faithful assistant. It was urgent to save something, but Oscar realized with horror that there was nothing to save in the faithful assistant. That is, Penelope was not around. By the time his wife and children returned from vacation, Oscar had no business left. He filed a lawsuit, although he understood perfectly well, to win it he has no chance. And so he did. The lawyer thumbed through the papers and shrugged his shoulders. But please, these are your signatures. You gave everything to Edward yourself. I don't know what I can do about it. When Penelope returned, she didn't recognize her husband, so dead he looked. When she heard the reason for his mood, she was horrified. She started to deal with it, but he convinced her that there was a raider seizure. It is not his fault, but just try two clever people. You can see how badly I feel, Penelope. Please, let's just close the subject for a little while. I thought I was going to have a heart attack, Oscar moaned sincerely, almost dying from all this. Yes, I can see that you look terrible, his wife agreed. But what to do now? We must fight. Chances to return, at least part of the business is there. And probably not. I've done everything I can, and you shouldn't get involved. I don't want it to get any worse. You'll have to accept it, Penelope. How much worse, she sighed. Well, okay, I will not go anywhere. But on what money we will live? Morgan's going to school. The girls are all grown up. We don't have any savings. What are we gonna do? Sell our stuff. I don't know, maybe it'll come down to this work. Then I'll go. I don't see any other way out, but not now. It's summer. I want to rest, I just can't pack now. And you see, said Penelope, I think that now you do not need to get a job and in the hospital to lie down to recover. Penelope guessed that the case is not just in the raider's seizure, that her husband's fault in what happened, but did not begin to understand. And even if completely guilty Oscar, then to fix it all the same will not be able to do anything. But I did not want to spoil relations with her husband, although it would seem that there's nothing to spoil. So some time passed. The situation did not improve, and the husband did not hurry to look for a job. Well, said finally Penelope, let's then all get a job, and you stay home and watch the kids. This option of development of events Oscar very much pleased. Okay, Penelope, I'm glad you offered. It's true, I'm in no condition to work for hire right now. He felt that not just at the moment is not able, he cannot at all. He had the education, but little or no business skills. Going to work, pretending to be a boss, that suited him fine. But to work himself with his hands and still obey someone else's orders. Oh, Penelope works. Homework seemed to Oscar not work, but a vacation. The children, fortunately, are no longer so tiny. The eldest is 10, the girls are 5, that is quite independent. Send them to school and kindergarten, in the evening to meet them, feed them, turn on the TV. Yes, anyone can do it. About the fact that a person engaged in housekeeping should still cook his own food, buy groceries, do the cleaning, he somehow did not think. His shopping trips were a disaster for the family budget. He just took whatever he could get his hands on. He brought home heavy bags, and then it turned out that there was nothing to eat. There was everything that was suitable only for fancy appetizers. Why didn't you buy meat, potatoes, vegetables? I gave you a list, surprised Penelope in the evenings, coming from work. Well, how could not buy? Here you bought, confused husband said. Yes, some bought. This is not something that children and adults cannot eat. Canned food, smoked food. What are you going to make soup out of? Porridge. Jen, do I have to cook it? No, honey, cooking is a woman's job. I've never done anything like that. I don't know how, and I don't want to learn. Well, if you're going to do the housework, you're going to have to cook. I'm very tired at work. And when I come home, what do I see? The kids are hungry. The place is a mess. It's a woman's job to clean, do the laundry. At the kindergarten, they complain that you bring the girls in dirty clothes, not well groomed, pick them up later than everyone else. And last week, the teacher had to take the girls home herself. Why are you acting like this? Because I didn't have time. I got tired and fell asleep, you know? So you didn't get them home on time once. It wouldn't kill your teachers to spend an extra hour with your kid. And Morgan's teacher's kind of weird. But we don't want to stay home with Dad. Let him work, and you'll be with us as usual, Morgan complained later. And don't let him come to school with me. He embarrassed me so bad. He yelled at the teacher, said she had to treat me special somehow. Now the kids are laughing at me, and the teacher's not happy either. Yes, let's let you come with us and take me to daycare. Dad's always late, and last time he brought us later than everyone else and yelled at the teacher because the door was closed. She even cried afterwards and told Daddy not to come anymore. Let Mommy come. Penelope realized the children are absolutely right, and the husband is absolutely not capable of neither household to lead, nor children to bring up. But what was she to do? Work she found very good and promising. Everyone was happy with her. The salary was decent. That her husband will find something similar, and most importantly, will successfully work there, she not without reason doubted. But things couldn't go on like this either. The children were practically abandoned. Everything could end badly. All his educational methods were limited to the fact that he sat them in front of the TV, put a pile of sweets in front of them, and told them to sit quietly. If he broke that order, he'd yell. Penelope herself got a job in a very solid firm as a senior manager. Education allowed to count on a quick promotion, and the chief soon noticed her talents. Felix in general was a man smart, perceptive, and once, discussing where their next work issues, asked, "What about your husband's business?" It turned out that way. Resonant case was in business circles, a lot of stories about it. Penelope began to recount the story from Oscar's words, talk about the raid or seizure and so on. But the boss said, "Yes, no, I heard another version. Your husband gave the company almost in the hands of a complete stranger. He didn't waste any time. That's what happened. Pretty reckless of him. And here's the weird thing. You didn't quit your job because of him, did you?" Penelope was confused. I do not know what to say. Felix realized that she simply was deceived. Husband decided not to develop this topic, but Penelope herself decided to talk about it with her husband. Coming home and seeing, as usual, a complete ruin, tried to find out what really happened. Sort of most importantly, when her husband will finally become, after all, a real master of the house, if he could not become a businessman. But Oscar, exhausted by idleness and insulting for a man's title of housewife, was not going to justify himself. "So you think I'm a bad husband? And you'd think you'd left me a perfect household. Yes, everything was trashed without me. The children are not well-mannered. Did you keep me busy? They don't obey at all. They're naughty all day long. I was a bad businessman. What would you know about it? Your ceiling is accounting. Working for the boss, and you can't do anything on your own. You're not a good hostess. And I've been scolded." "I'm not scolding you. I'm just asking, who did you give our farm to and on what grounds?" "I gave it to the right person. It was my business. You had nothing to do with it." And, realizing there was no way to dodge, Oscar blurted out, "And if you don't like it, I can leave." "Well, go away. It seems that no one will cry for you here." "I don't have the strength to carry everything on my shoulders anymore. You're all bad. The kid's me. You're the only good one. You can't make sense of what you're doing. You can't make sense of anything. You're the one hanging around my neck." "That's it. Not anymore. I want to divorce you myself," Oscar raged. "And very well. Just be aware we will not share the apartment. You don't get anything here. No alimony if you're interested. I know it's useless. I don't care about your apartment. Who needs it?" Oscar understood. His situation is unenviable, but at that moment it seemed that there was nothing worse than to remain living in the house in the position of a male housewife, which all dissatisfied. Let her fend for herself with her children and her household, while she worked and did everything. But he will still come up, and she will still cry and call him back, but it'll be too late. He won't think of forgiving such humiliation. After Oscar finally left the family, Penelope had to urgently look for a nanny. That's how Michelle appeared in our house. A young, modest girl. She didn't have much experience. But Penelope liked the fact that at least she did not hide it, and said that she was capable and wanted to learn everything. There's really no experience with other people's children. But I am, after all, the oldest of 4 children in the family. So I've been babysitting since I was 5 years old. Don't doubt that I'll do it. If something doesn't work out or it's not the way you want it to be, you just say so. I am very easy to adjust to a new way." Penelope was pleased to have such an assistant and decided that now the domestic problems are finally solved. Now the children would be under supervision. And at first it was like that. Although Susan and Tara didn't like the nanny very much. "She doesn't play with us. She just scolds us and puts us in the corner. We don't want to be in the corner. Maybe you've been misbehaving, but that's okay. You'll get used to it and everything will be fine. I think Michelle is very nice. And I do not even know what you were dissatisfied," answered the mother. For the first time for a long time, received the opportunity to really relax at home. "Ah, Michelle, I am so glad that I found you," said Penelope to the nanny. She, taking advantage of the good attitude of the mistress, began to feel in charge of the house. After a while, Penelope noticed that Michelle is already on her and shouts, and constantly complains that the mistress leaves little money for groceries and all necessary things, although Penelope knew how to count much better than the housekeeper. In the end, she realized Michelle is not just misappropriating some of the money given to the household, but also launches his hand into the money box. And this was completely unacceptable. She did not want to scandalize and Slay calculated the nanny. But in this way, she was again left without help. Michelle had to be fired in one day. It was not so easy to find another nanny with housekeeping duties. A retired neighbor, Riley, came to the rescue. Penelope knew her from her years as a school teacher. But now Grandma lived alone. Her son, his family had gone abroad, visited his mother rarely. Their communication had become mostly virtual, and the old woman, accustomed to talking to someone, was lonely. Meeting and talking in the yard with Penelope, she sympathized with her and suggested, "So, Penelope, let me be the day while you are at work, look after the guys. I can cook and help Morgan with lessons, explain what is not clear, and maybe clean up if necessary. I've got a head on my shoulders too, and mental work, helps keep my vitality up. Oh, I'd be very grateful to you, and I'll pay for everything." "Of course, do not worry," Penelope rejoiced, knowing about the neatness and conscientiousness of the former teacher. "But this is not necessary. I, Penelope's services do not trade, and in money do not need. The pension is enough. In addition, my son still sends a little. I myself can pay you for giving me the opportunity to understand the guys. After all, communicating with them, I myself get younger. The children were not averse to spend time with friendly and intelligent grandmother." Penelope had free time and confidence that everything was fine with her son and daughters. But that didn't last long. Yes, the legs and arms did not bother. Riley has a bright head, but here the heart failed the elderly woman at the most inopportune moment. One afternoon, when she brought the girls home from daycare and Morgan from school and fed them lunch, she suddenly felt sick, and the pills she needed had been left at home. It didn't seem like much of a problem, the apartment next door. But Riley suddenly felt she couldn't get up. Her heart was an unbearable pain. She couldn't get enough air, and there were only little kids around. Morgan was doing his homework in his room. With difficulty, she called out to one of her sisters, "Susan, get Morgan." She decided that the boy, the oldest at the time, would be able to help her. The girls, realizing that the matter was bad, rushed to their brother in tears. "Morgan, Grandma's in a bad way. She's pale and breathing hard." The frightened boy rushed to his sister's room and saw Riley in the most terrible condition. She was about to lose consciousness. With a relaxed hand, she pulled the key to her apartment out of her pocket. She wanted to tell him how to open the door, where to get the medicine, but the key fell out of her powerless fingers. Her eyes closed, and she lost consciousness. With trembling hands, Morgan called an ambulance, explained what had happened, and asked his sisters to call his mother. But he sat down on the floor and fell into a strange stupor. Penelope realized from her daughter's call that something terrible was going on at home. She arrived just as Riley was being rushed to the hospital with a heart attack, amid the cries of the children. "Where's Morgan?" asked the terrified mother. "And he's in the apartment," the paramedic replied grimly. He was in shock. "You shouldn't leave children with barely alive grandmothers. I gave him a shot now." Penelope rushed into the apartment. Morgan slept perfectly calm at first glance. But how could the shock really turn out? Turns out, the sight of a dying woman didn't go unnoticed by the boy. He woke up, looked almost the same as always, but looked past those who spoke to him. He didn't respond to the words. Penelope was going through the most difficult time of her life. She couldn't quit her job, nor could she find a nanny for the girls, and she was afraid to get involved with anyone. Thrown between the office, kindergarten, home, hospital, after all had to hospitalize. But not for long. The physical condition of the boy did not inspire concern, and mental too. Yes, he didn't speak, but his basic reactions were normal. This condition could last for any length of time, although everything can improve at any time, the doctor reassured. "Well, I guess we can't wait. We have to treat it," Penelope exclaimed. "Absolutely. but it is not necessary to be in the hospital and take a seat. Do not worry, everything is remediable. Well, how not to worry if your child's smart, healthy boy, after the experience cannot talk. We started going to doctors, to the best and most expensive specialists, and all to no avail. Penelope was exhausted. She was on the edge. One evening, driving through the city, she noticed an elderly man wandering down the street. He looked like a vagrant, and there was such hopelessness and resignation to fate in his whole figure. Hello, she approached the stranger. Let me invite you to my house. It's cold now. You probably need to warm up. Grandpa looked at her with unhappy but clear eyes, but he couldn't say anything. Apparently his lips were frozen. He let himself into the car, but he looked completely uncomprehending. When we got to the house, he asked, "Who are you and why did you take me off the street?" Call of the heart. I just felt it was the right thing to do, that's all. I hope that's enough, Penelope smiled. It is enough. However, why or why not is not important. And I like your explanation better than any other. Penelope saw that the man was not well. It is clear that he has been wandering the streets for a long time. He's old, he's hungry. But more than that, he's suffering from a grief he's been unable to cope with. And that's the reason for his present condition. She sat him down in the kitchen, explained to the children who had come out to greet him that he was their guest. "Hello," the girl said quietly. Morgan stared at him in silence. The incident with Riley had kept him so mute. From his daughters, silent. Now the children could be left home alone without fear or worry for them. Penelope sat her grandfather down at the table, warmed up the food, set it in front of him. "Thank you, honey. I thought, that's it, the end has come." "No, there was a good angel for me," said the guest. "I don't know what I could pay for all this." "Neither do I, but it seems to me that our acquaintance is not accidental. You're not a bad man yourself, by all accounts. Something tells me I am. I guess you just ran into something bad. And what's your name?" "Penelope," she answered. "Penelope, can we you?" "Yes, once was not a bad man and did not take bribes. And my name was Casper. But it was a long time ago, in a past life. A lot of things have changed since then, and I've become what I've become, a tramp and a bum. In general, Grandpa is my nickname among my new colleagues for collecting glassware and metal. Not without humor, you'll agree." "You can call me that too," he replied. "What is this nonsense? I don't collect glassware to make jokes like that. Since you are a Dr. Casper, maybe give me a little advice. With son trouble." So Penelope told him what happened to Morgan. Actually, at his age, that doesn't happen very often. And treatment, I agree, is not easy. But I hope your case isn't the most difficult. I've looked at the boy, and it appears he's suffering from his own condition. So there's no brain damage. They can image fart data. Penelope liked that answer. Grandfather did not promise her a quick, 100% cure. In fact, he was just being trustworthy. Even Casper had been surprised when she'd offered to stay the night. "Are not you too trusting, Penelope?" "I have such a flaw, but I think not in your case. I've been burned a few times lately, but the fact that I trust you, it seems to me right. And I don't have the strength to do it alone. I'm alone with 3 kids and a lot of problems. So you see, I'm not so selfless," Penelope smiled. "Who of us worse? That's another question. Maybe I suffer for the cause." "You doctor said," replied Grandpa. "I too have made many mistakes because of my character. Helping others to solve their problems, I let mine go to waste. And I ended up where I am. I don't want to be intrusive, but still, how is it? You're an intelligent man, doctor, obviously without bad habits. I'm sorry." Penelope was really uncomfortable questioning the new acquaintance, but she wondered how he could be so low. Casper apparently understood everything and was not offended. On the contrary, he was expecting such a question.
"Mercy, Penelope, you and picked me up on the street, brought to your house, where your children live, put at your table and apologize. I would be surprised, worried, if you had not asked this question. However, the answer is simple: gullibility, unwillingness to enter into conflicts, inability to build relationships with the most dear people. My first wife died right after my son Dustin was born. I never thought about another marriage."
As long as my mom was alive, she helped. She basically took over Dustin's upbringing. But when he was 10, she was gone. It's hard for a father to raise a kid alone, so he started looking for a wife. And of course he found one. Guess which one? Young beauty, probably, smiled sadly Penelope. Well, no, such I was not looking for. I needed first and foremost a mother for my son. 2 years later, I married Audrey. Good, kind, caring, wonderful hostess and widow. Mother of Kevin's boy, 2 years younger than mine. I thought they'd grow up like two brothers, be friends. But what happened? It was either those 2 years too far apart or childish jealousy. I don't know, the boys didn't get along. Besides, they're different ages and different personalities. And Kevin didn't treat me the best. Maybe that's why they fought so much, and I didn't always behave right. I discounted my son, I stood up for my adopted son. Well, then they grew up. Dustin went to college, and when he was in his penultimate year, he disappeared. He wanted to be a biologist, too. I talked him out of it. By then, our relationship hadn't exactly soured, but it had gotten cooler. So he went on some expeditions and disappeared without a trace. His wife had died by then. Her son had done his best to get on our nerves. She had a heart condition, so it was just me and him. Kevin realized you can't just kill me like that. He literally started to mock me. I ended up with no apartment and no roof over my head. How could you do that? With indignation exclaimed Penelope. After all, you had all the rights were. It was necessary to fight. There are lawyers, the courts are, everything is. But the forces are not. There are times when there is no hope. Sometimes it's easier to die than to start a scandal. And now what? It wasn't yesterday. For 10 years I've been living with one hope, to see my son. For some reason I believe that he's alive, that he'll come back. I understand hope. But they searched for him. Then they declared him dead, though no one saw him alive or dead. That's what gives me hope. They leaned over the table, as if looking at the patterns on the tablecloth. Her grandfather's sad tale touched Penelope to the core. I don't know what I can do to help you, Penelope said at a loss. You have already helped. Perhaps now it is time to sleep. Late already. Tomorrow I will see your Morgan. Penelope looked at Casper with hopeful eyes full of tears. She went to make his bed. In the morning, the guest took care of the problem. Casper read the other doctor's conclusions, agreed with some, not so much with some. And then he examined the boy himself and, oh wonder, the boy made his first sound in a long time. So far, however, nothing meaningful but quite realized. That's good, but it's only the beginning of a long journey. There's a lot of work to be done. The elderly doctor had to stay at Penelope's house to study with Morgan, which everyone was only happy.
Penelope began to leave a new acquaintance without fear and with the younger daughters. The girls were very happy. Soon they began to call him Grandpa and said that with him much better than with evil little and old grandmother Riley.
He's so much fun to be with. He is also engaged with us. Daughters told alternately daughters returned from work Penelope. And he will not get sick, like Grandma Riley. Yes, no, said the mother, herself somehow sure of it. And things were not going well at work. Well, that is not her, but the owner of the company. Penelope at some point clearly realized he threatened trouble no less than happened with Oscar's business. And that is, the problems are much more serious, and the firm is much larger, and conspiracy conceived not greedy girl and her beau, and people much more dangerous. One thing that Felix, such an experienced and intelligent man, did not notice anything, already says something. Maybe Penelope would not have noticed the danger, but she had a sad experience, and she rather did not see, but felt something wrong. Thanks to this, the conspiracy was uncovered. The intruders instead of the firm and income got what they deserved. And Felix did not know how to thank his employee. Penelope, I owe you my life. This firm for me everything. If I lost it, God forbid, I would not want to live. Believe me, ask for what you want. You want an apartment, children abroad for treatment, studies, vacations, anything you ask. But come on, Felix, I don't need anything. My children are small, I can't send them away alone. The company without supervision, now also afraid to leave, joked Penelope, but then immediately regained, unless you seem to have good connections with law enforcement. There are investigators different, or I do not know what you need specialists. Yes, any will find. Penelope, from under the ground, any criminal will pull out of the ground, and in any prison will put. Felix was clearly in a blow. No, no, no. Such services are not needed. I need to find a man who disappeared many years ago without a trace, and even declared dead. But there may be hope that he's alive. That is, if it is possible that he is. The warden grew serious, but not because he was going to say no. You know I'm not a detective, but I can find one, and the best. You'll need the exact details of this man. Photographs, preferably. And anything else you know. I can't say that quickly, but I think he'll be at your feet. So Penelope hurried home to find out from Casper everything about his missing son. Alas, the grandfather's papers were almost non-existent. Foster son tried, but his memory was strong. So Penelope wrote down everything he could tell her about his son's disappearance. She thought about it, at the same time to ask for Felix's lawyers to find out if he could get his apartment back. After all, the actions of Kevin's adopted son cannot be left unpunished, and took up the case. But I don't think it will be possible to get anything out of Kevin. I asked only for Morgan without even mentioning it. That's all that matters to me. If I can at least convince him to find out something, that's good enough for me. I'm willing to live my whole life in the open air for that.
The next day, Felix was very active. Although both he and his experts did not promise quick results, but hope still lingered, and Penelope had her own joy. Morgan had begun to speak. It was a great joy. After all, she had almost despaired, and even the doctors she'd seen before were surprised at the result. They had only hoped for a partial recovery of speech.
Casper waited. He didn't hope for a quick result either, but he was so anxious to hear something. Poor father, Penelope thought. I don't even know whether it would be better to find my son alive or not. For if he is alive and comes here, I'll have him by the hair. But where is this scene? Abandoning a father in such a state. But it wasn't what they thought it would be. Dustin was found. He'd gotten lost on an expedition up north. He fell and suffered a serious injury that would have probably killed him. But as luck would have it, he was found by the locals. They brought him to the house of a local witch doctor. He took care of the young man for several months, who did not regain consciousness for a long time. Then it turned out that he almost completely lost his memory. But even when Dustin did come to his senses and remembered everything, he still would not be able to get the civilization. The injuries to his head and spine had almost completely immobilized him. The healer never gave up his efforts, but he wasn't sure the boy would ever walk again. Over the years, however, he did get around on crutches and still did not ask to be sent home. What's the use of a cripple there, he thought. Father's not young anymore. He has an adopted son. Even though Kevin was a complete scoundrel in his youth, maybe he's reformed, helping his father. And if not, there's really no reason for me to be there. I'll be a burden to my dad, and Kevin will only make fun of me. I'd rather stay here, where I'm used to, where good people are used to me. And I'm at ease here. He may have regretted his decision, but the longer he lived in the wilderness, the more terrifying it was to return to his old life. Even when they found him and sent a helicopter, Dustin was hesitant, reluctant to go home, afraid, especially after learning of all the circumstances. Well, am I going to go? I mean, it's embarrassing. I thought my father was doing well. I'd only ruin his life. And now I won't. He has so many problems. Here I am still, he thought. But where to go? He went. He was tired of loneliness and the unsettledness of life. And there Penelope in full began to solve the issue with the apartment Casper. It was easier than finding Dustin. Kevin didn't bother with the documents, kicked out his stepfather and decided that the apartment was his now. But it wasn't. And soon he found himself on the street. And happy Casper, having found his son again, returned to his apartment. He was happy, thanked fate, which so changed his life. If not for Penelope, I would not be alive. I was freezing in the street when she picked me up. We'd never have seen each other again. Compared to that, everything else is such a small thing. Although now that you're in serious need of treatment, an apartment is no small thing. If you'd come back like this, where would we live? Casper said. What do you mean, where would we live? Dad, you have an apartment, don't you? I don't understand why you gave it to Kevin so easily. Dustin asked. But I wasn't myself, to be honest. I had a lot on my mind. You were gone, my wife's dead, and Kevin's doing whatever he wants. I just couldn't take it anymore, you know? And I didn't feel like I needed it anymore. I didn't even want to live. I thought I'd just die in the country, that's all. I thought you were doing well. Now you see they're offering me a checkup, and I wanted to go to the hospital. Do you think it's worth it? Is it worth it? You're asking the doctor. Of course it's worth it. If I was younger, I could do it. But I can still do something now. I still have my brains and I still know some people, though they probably think I died a long time ago. But they showed up, and I'm going to ask for their help. I have to get treatment. What about the exam? Did it reveal all the underlying problems? Dustin asked. The doctor said that a cure was possible, but it would require surgery, which cost money. The injections alone will not do the job, Casper replied. So we'll sell the apartment, said Casper. After all, he was willing to do anything for the treatment of his son. Well, yes, of course, sell. And where will we live? Whether I will be healthy or not, it is still unknown. And wandering the streets, well, what's the point? His son disagreed with him. Where will we get the money? The sum is unaffordable, sighed Casper. Penelope took part in this conversation and could not help but say her word. So wait, you with the sale of the apartment. Can't we somehow manage without such drastic measures? I have a lot to be grateful to Casper for, too. Yes, she had hoped for a significant improvement in her financial situation. Felix, having fulfilled her request, decided not to stop and gave her the management of the branch of his company. I can see, Penelope, how well you are doing. I realize that your potential is too great, and use you as a regular employee is unwise. If you successfully take over the branch, it will be beneficial to both of us, he said. And he was certainly not wrong. Penelope, using her management talents, was able to significantly improve the work of the unit. In addition, to solve some of her past problems, namely, she broke the firm once owned by her husband. This turned out to be not so difficult. The young men at the helm believed too much in their omnipotence and lost all caution. As a result, she bought the firm for nothing and became the owner. To her surprise, she met her ex-husband there. He left with nothing after the divorce, had tried to find a job, but nothing came out of it. So he was not suited for any serious business. He went to his ex-wife's former office asking for help with anything. And most importantly, she mockingly gave him a job as a security guard. It's a demanding job, of course, and you're not exactly known for your integrity. But Edward and I will take our chances, just until the first notice, she said. So the former businessman had to stand at the gate in full view of his former subordinates. And the most frustrating part was seeing his former mistress with her current beau all the time. They had already become husband and wife, very respectable and important gentlemen, but their prosperity was short-lived. The firm had to be sold for pennies. They had neither the wit nor ability to resist the onslaught of Penelope. Oscar, on the other hand, continued to work as a security guard. And you can imagine how he was amazed to see his ex-wife as the new owner of the company which once belonged to him. So he only had time to rejoice at Scarlett and Edward's collapse. But not only did it startle him, it even raised some hopes in him. After all, they hadn't been married that long, they loved each other, they had children in common. So maybe, it turned out not. Penelope quickly dotted all the I's and said that if he wanted to continue working at least as a security guard, he should behave accordingly. Oscar, you and I have been divorced for a long time. If you're not being asked for alimony, you should at least be grateful for that, and leave the innuendo out of it, she replied firmly to his attempts at reproachment. But I'm still the father of our children, he reminded her. I want to live with them and raise them. You know, I already know your talent for parenting, so you'd better stay away from the children, she said. But if you even go out with them, that's your right, of course. But nothing can happen between us. I'm a hostess, you're an employee. That's all the relationship we have left. Oscar was very angry at that answer. But what could he do? Only dream that the once lost happiness could return to him. However, his dreams could not come true. Soon he learned that the new boss might be getting married. It turned out that the rumors were not in vain. Penelope was not going to stop helping Casper and his son either. She continued to communicate with them, and the children did not forget the kind grandfather. although they already had a professional governess. Not a day went by without socializing with Casper and now his son, Penelope, too. She talked a lot with the elderly doctor as well, but even more with Dustin. He talked a lot and interestingly about his life in the wilderness, about what he once dreamed of becoming, and the reasons that kept him from returning to a normal life. I realized it was cruel to my father, but wouldn't it be more cruel if I returned as a helpless invalid? I was very much afraid of that, and it seems not in vain. Penelope, without your help we could never have done it, he said. But I'm sure I couldn't have done it without yours either, she replied. And soon Dustin was admitted to the hospital. He underwent surgery, and it was quite successful. The doctors promised that with diligent exercise he would be able to walk as well as Wasson. Yes, there was rehabilitation to be done. He was happy, but his greatest happiness was that he and Penelope had developed a good relationship. She often visited him in the clinic, sometimes with the children, sometimes alone. And during this time they had become really close and dear people. Therefore, no one was particularly surprised when after discharge they announced their desire to get married. "Doesn't the fact that I have 3 children stop you?" Penelope asked. "What, are you kidding? How could it stop me?" Dustin was surprised. "I love them as if they were my own. After we get married, I'll be a real daddy to them. Or do you think I'm not the right one?" Penelope responded with a happy kiss. In the evening, the loud sounds of Indian melodrama could be heard in the house. The cheerful music sounded like mockery. Julia's daughter-in-law, the lady of the house, had been doing chores late into the night. Now she was tearfully scrubbing the floors of the spacious 4-room apartment, while Mendelssohn's March played in her head and the words came to mind registrar. "Do you, Linda, agree to be Christopher's wife?" Why had she agreed? Gave in to her fiancé's entreaties to live with her mother. She put on her wedding ring and was transported into a dark world of hopelessness. Christopher, indulging his mother in everything, did not believe his wife. There was no miracle. Her husband was not going to support and protect her in a difficult moment. And the mother-in-law was dodgy, weaving intrigues, loaded unnecessary work, conspired against the daughter-in-law. It was not the difficulties of family life that frightened Linda, but Christopher's misunderstanding, the unfairness of life. Today she was worried that she had scrubbed the floors for the second time only because her mother-in-law did not believe her, because she had already cleaned the whole house in the morning. In the evening, Christopher supported his mother, not understanding why his wife was stubbornly unable to do simple housework. When she finished cleaning, Linda quietly snuck into the bathroom and closed herself in. Here she could give free rein to her feelings, rest from the family burden. The well-appointed apartment, unlike her country house, was a joy to bathe in at any time, without heating the stove. It was a small consolation to Linda. She missed the peacefulness of the village, her yard, the warmth of communication with the villagers. She drew water with a snow-white cap of foam and sank into the tub with pleasure. She remembered again the carefree moments of her unmarried life, and then her acquaintance with Christopher and her sudden wedding. Linda had fallen in love with the kind guy on the motorcycle. At first sight, Christopher then came to his grandmother in the village. One day, driving through the village, he saw a lovely girl with a black braid down to her waist, a gentle look, and a basket in her hands. It was a marvelous vision, as if a forest nymph had come out of the pages of books. She was walking with the little girl's basket, which had been composed to her by a kind-hearted grandmother for a letter from her son. Christopher stopped and asked her to treat him to a strange berry he had never seen before. Thus began a relationship. The guy surrounded his beloved with care and invited her to live in his luxurious 4-room apartment. Linda immediately did not like Julia Urban, spoiled woman who did not want a soul in her son. She disapproved of her son's girlfriend and called her cunning. And here was a gift from Christopher, a village shepherdess, an orphan of Kazan, without a family and tribe. Linda buried her parents long ago and lived poorly, a lonely postmistress. And at her husband's insistence, she quit her job and moved to the city. Why? What for? There was a persistent knock at the door. Julia's irritated voice brought her out of her reverie. Are you at it again? How many times have I told you not to lock the door? How many times have I told you not to lock the doors? You haven't brought a penny into the house yourself, and yet there you are, a lady bathing every day. Open the door at once. I have to go to the bathroom. I have a scheduled beauty treatment. Mom, what's wrong? Christopher came running to the door. Your wife wouldn't clean my room, so I had to do it myself. I have a bad back. The medicine's in the bathroom. I've been here for an hour and she won't do it. And she was rude to me. Talk to your wife. You're doing the same old thing. You're slandering me, Mom. Linda opened the door in astonishment, hastily climbing out of the bathroom. It's been 15 minutes, and I've mopped the floors in every room, she objected. Look at you, you cheeky girl. Get out of my sight. Julia shoved her sister-in-law violently in the side, causing her to fall. Linda, stop quarreling with your mother, Christopher said coldly. Show some respect. Please, if it's not too much trouble for your highness. He turned around and walked away. Angrily stupid. Day after day, her mother-in-law nagged, making up tall tales, complaining about her deteriorating health because of such an ungrateful daughter-in-law. Linda baked pies, cooked French and Italian dishes, studied new recipes, watched blogs on homemaking. Nothing worked. The main goal of the mother-in-law was to get rid of her daughter-in-law by any means necessary, to kick her out for no reason, because such a girl is out of status. Christopher was a famous lawyer, and his late husband was a prosecutor. They still had long-standing ties. They had important visitors, very influential people in the city. Julia was shy of Linda, who didn't know how to handle cutlery. Linda dressed simply gray, refused to go to beauty salons. Her unwillingness to get her hair and nails done made Julia mad at guests. Mother-in-law politely, but coldly pulled her daughter-in-law, told her not to show her face to anyone. A hard, tedious, joyless year passed. Linda got a job as a saleswoman in a store near the house. Her husband stopped giving her money at her mother's instigation. At work, her daughter-in-law was relieved from the endless reproaches. But at home, it got worse. Now, Julia reproached her daughter-in-law for not doing her chores. My darling, you're always at work, and your husband must be fed and cared for. I'll talk to my son, so he won't let you slack off from housework. Mom, I have time for everything, Linda objected. I cook in advance, everything's in order. I clean up morning and night. What's this new fashion of working? Quit working. I'm ashamed you're working as a saleswoman with a husband like that. It's a disgrace. Christopher doesn't even leave me money for my household because of you. And I still have a house in the country to keep, bills to pay. Orphan of Kazan, you don't need to spend our money. Christopher buys everything for the house. The arguments upset Linda. Later, her mother-in-law reprimanded her son for how rudely his wife talks to her, does not listen to her advice. Linda was deeply hurt by Julia's words that she was ashamed of her uneducated daughter-in-law. It was painful to remember why Linda never enrolled in the institute. Hope was the pride of her parents. She graduated from high school with honors, planned to enter the medical academy. But a month after graduation, her parents were in an accident, returning from the city. My father died in the hospital without regaining consciousness. Mom slipped into a coma. For 6 months, Linda traveled to all the hospitals, begging in the hope of saving her mother, bribed, begged for an operation. But the situation was hopeless. No one could help. Mom never woke up again. Having buried her mother, Linda was left an orphan. To get by, she worked part-time in a store, then found a job at the post office. The road to the academy was closed. There was nothing to pay for her studies. Linda spent all the money she had saved on hospitalization and funeral expenses. The hard fate did not bother her mother-in-law. She could not allow a homeless girl from the village to run her house. Julia found a new way to get rid of her daughter-in-law. "Christopher," she said to her son, "we need an heir. Why can't your wife get pregnant?" "Mom, it's been so little time. Perhaps it's too soon to talk about children." "My dear, a child will help reconcile us all. My dear, it's such a blessing. I'd be so happy if you'd give me a grandchild." The cunning mother-in-law cried and hugged her son. "All right, I'll talk to Linda. But I agree, it's up to me." In the evening, Christopher pleased his wife with his desire to have children. He didn't say anything about his mother's request. Julia went to extreme measures, which became known later. Linda rejoiced at the possibility of becoming a mom. A child could really soften her husband, and her life would be happier. She had been living with the dream of a child since her wedding, but she had been unable to get pregnant. Another 6 months passed. Linda cried as she held the pregnancy test in her hands. Disappointment again. Fear settled in her soul. Her mother-in-law would scream, her husband would support her mother and angrily slam the door. For the second month, he began to appear less often at home, stayed late at work, met with friends. Julia was satisfied she had broken up the young people after all. There was one last step to take. One day, Linda came into the room and saw Christopher. He was sitting there with his face twisted with anger. When he saw his wife, he swung and hit her in the face. "Ungrateful bitch," he shouted and threw a packet of pills at her. "How dare you lie to me and Mom? Explain to me what these are." "These are pills, but this is the first time I've seen them." Linda read the instructions with shaking hands. They were birth control pills. The weight of the last few months of endless humiliation, frustration, and disappointment fell on her in an instant. She collapsed without feeling, no longer wanting to live and breathe in this cruel, absurd world. Christopher, although angry at his wife, felt guilty, but could not bring her to her senses and called an ambulance. Julia snickered at the pills and indifferently sent her daughter-in-law to the hospital. "Mom, why is she doing this to me?" Christopher complained bitterly to his mother. I told you, I told you. I told you, I told you, I told you, I told you. Don't you dare forgive her. This is no way to get a divorce, Mother. I promised her she'd be happy, but she lied to me too. I'll go to work early in the morning, and then I'll visit my wife and talk to her calmly. 3 days later, Linda was discharged. She took the bus home. Christopher didn't meet her, he was at work. A suitcase and a note from her husband about the divorce were waiting for her at home. Her mother-in-law was triumphant. She threw Linda out without letting her wait for her husband. She was just a village idiot, and she still is. You shouldn't have messed with all of us. Get out. I can't see you, you snake. You wanted to separate me from my son. It won't happen. Out, out, I said, immediately. So that you don't breathe. The mother-in-law shouted after her, unwilling to stop her anger and triumph at the same time. In the evening, Christopher found out that his wife had left. Mom, why didn't Linda wait for me? How dare she leave me? Why didn't she say anything? Calm down, son. It was her decision. Julia was careful not to mention the note she'd written, copying her son's handwriting. But how? She didn't even leave a note. You two haven't been getting along for a long time. This woman isn't right for you. What will that hillbilly have for you? Without children, there's no family. It's an omen that if she did, she'd give birth to an inbred simple thing that's nothing to breed. Look for a wife of status by getting rid of your daughter-in-law. Julia felt over the moon she had gotten her way on the plan. For a year, she drank Linda a decoction of wormwood, convincing her that this tea is good for women's health, hoping to bring a young, healthy girl to infertility. Then she slipped her birth control pills. Christopher was upset. He figured Linda hadn't forgiven him for the slap. With longing in his heart, he walked across the room where he smelled her perfume. Sitting down on the bed, he went through the pills. A suspicion crept into his soul. The packages were intact, all the pills in place. Perhaps Linda hadn't taken them. He remembered hundreds of moments when his wife had cried and complained about her mother and he hadn't believed her. The bitter discovery struck his heart with the pain of no return, of loss. He himself, with his own hands, had destroyed love. There is no forgiveness, but Linda is his beloved, without whom it is so lonely and dreary. He will rent an apartment for her, and tomorrow he will go to the village to beg for forgiveness. An Indian song was playing loudly in the next room. Julia, with a blissful smile, was triumphant. She was more at ease when others were suffering, but her carefree life did not last long. One day she would receive a letter that would turn her whole life upside down, change her character, teach her to be compassionate, empathize, do good. But now she was far from even a moment's regret for her dastardly deed. Christopher didn't get out to his wife's home village right away. He had to see the client through to the end. A week later, he took a vacation and went to Linda. As 2 years ago, he decided to ride a motorcycle to return former feelings. He did not inform his mother about his departure. He was offended by her, tried to avoid talking. He even looked anxiously at his sad son, hoping that time would heal him. Julia was already looking for a worthy match for him, obedient society girl, which will distract from sad thoughts. More than once she tried to talk about divorce, but the son waved away, avoiding an answer. Christopher settled all his affairs, packed his backpack secretly from his mother, and left the house. It was a clear spring day, bright. Gladly he set off on his long-awaited journey. Soon he would meet his beloved, whom he missed incredibly. It seemed to him that just today their family would open a new page of life. They would be happy, for he loved Linda so much. The road was covered with frost from the morning. In Siberia, even in May, there were frosts. Prudently, Christopher wore a balaclava and helmet, but the summer tires could fail. But that didn't stop his desire to impress Linda, to revive pleasant memories. The voice of reason was silent as Christopher accelerated, feeling a rush of energy, freedom, and lightness of mind. It was a 2-hour non-stop ride to the village. The road was a country road, not a soul around. After an hour and a half, Christopher carelessly jumped into the oncoming lane. At that time, a tractor appeared from behind the corner. It was too late to stop. He jerked the wheel to the left. The bike rammed into bushes and hit a tree. The brakes didn't work. The wheels skidded. Christopher was thrown from the saddle and rolled down the side of the road. He was unlucky to have a savior. The driver of the tractor was Max, an ex-con who didn't want to be investigated again. He slowed down, hoping to help the motorcyclist. But Christopher showed no signs of life. So Max took his things, got back into the tractor and drove off, leaving the unfortunate man to die. He didn't say anything about the accident, didn't even feel remorse. It was an accident. It was not the tractor driver's fault. And humanity, unfortunately, is inherent in few people. On the same day, Julia's mother missed her son. She found out that he had taken a week's vacation, but he wasn't answering his phone. What a stubborn man, went to his redneck. Did I alarm him or what? Julia thought. She knew where Linda lived before her marriage, but she was not going to go to her place. She decided to wait a week and see. Julia called her mother Peggy in the village to ask if her grandson had shown up. No, he hadn't. Her son's cell phone went dead. A week later, he still hadn't returned. She decided to go to the village herself. She reached Peggy's mother, whom she rarely saw or spoke to. The news was shocking. It had been a year since Christopher had visited his grandmother, whose name was Madeline. He had not come to the village a week ago, nor yesterday, nor the day before. Linda, the letter carrier, do you know anything? Julia asked her mother. It's your sister-in-law, my dear. Are you out of your mind? Peggy was silent, shaking her head. Something flashed in her eyes. She hasn't been in the village for years. Didn't she come to live with you? She and Christopher have been divorced for 2 weeks. Where else would she go but to the village? She's been away. We're almost next door, 2 houses down. Julia, you're not making a mess, are you? I know you. I know you. Where did the kids go? They ran away from you, didn't they? They did the right thing. I raised a viper, not a daughter. You don't show your face around here, you don't help your mother. If it wasn't for Christopher, I'd be all alone. Mom, you never understood me. And I couldn't stand this village. What good is it? I'm sorry, but I was raising my son. It was hard. He's back on his feet. He hasn't forgotten anyone. That's my son. I raised him that way. So you survived, Linda? I was a redneck myself, remember? You got a temper, Julia. I'm ashamed I raised a daughter like that. Peggy told me what happened. Why did the children run away from you? My son must have gone to Linda's. His motorcycle's not in the garage. Where did it go? I don't know. I'm so sorry. Julia couldn't hold back any longer. She clasped her hands together and wailed. Son, where are you, my darling? It's all my own fault. Let's go together, Peggy. Maybe they're lurking out there living. I'll give you the address. It's no use. I don't go. You go on your own and don't come back to my place alone. It'll be safer. You go, I'll call you if the kids turn up. Julia went to the address, but no one was home. She knocked at neighbors' houses. Went all around the neighborhood. Still, there was neither Linda nor her husband for a year. No one came. No one knocked. Julia, by old habit, went to collect information in the village, in the store, at the post office, at the club. But it was as if Linda had vanished into thin air. With a heavy heart, she returned to the city. The trail had been broken. Her friends and acquaintances didn't know where her son was. He never showed up for work, never signed his resignation papers. Christopher disappeared without a trace. The last desperate step, a report to the police about the disappearance. For another year, Julia pounded the thresholds of government agencies, visited her mother in the village. There was no sign of her son. Later, remorse overwhelmed Julia. Nothing could dull the pain of loss. It was impossible to believe in her son's death. So she lived lonely, remembering the moments when they were together, though not always friendly. As long as he lived with that hillbilly, as long as he was near. The house was hopelessly silent now. Julia cried at the window all day long with an absent look, but she believed that her son would return. The story didn't end there. Christopher survived. He was saved by a family of witch doctors from the village of Red, which was in the neighborhood of his native village. It was an abandoned village with a few houses, where only the old residents remained to live. They traveled to their native village for everything they needed: groceries, things, small household items. On that fateful day, the daughter of the old witch Dr. Luba went to the store through the village. First she saw a mangled motorcycle, and a little farther away Christopher unconscious. What grief! He must have crashed. What a handsome man he was. She sighed and shook her head. The girl's name was Roberta. She was trained in first aid and often helped her mother treat people. Roberta checked and realized that the young man was alive, but it was not customary for the old-timers to call an ambulance. They lived in the same family, in case of trouble helped each other themselves. So Roberta ran for help. Christopher was taken to Luba's house. Things were bad. The victim hadn't regained consciousness for a week. They searched around the motorcycle, but they didn't find any documents, phone, or belongings. They were taken by a resourceful tractor driver so that there would be no trace of them at all. The stuff was just for his own use. He burned all the papers, even his passport. There was a man and he's gone, missing. The stranger woke up on the 8th day. Next to him sat a black-eyed beauty with a thick braid. When she saw that the patient opened his eyes, she jumped up and cried out. "Mommy, he's awake. Come here." A young but stately woman came in, bent over him, held his hand. "My dear, how will you live now? Where did you come from? What's your name?" But Christopher was so weak he couldn't speak. He shook his head, trying to say something, but he couldn't get a word out. "Roberta, go and get him some broth and tea." "I guess he can't talk. Then maybe he'll write from where?" The man was horrified to realize that he didn't remember his own name. Moreover, he didn't know who he used to be or who he even was. He hammered desperately, trying to get up, fell silent and lost consciousness again. He was later brought out. That's right, resiliently. The guys brought his motorcycle back, put it back together. They wanted to use it to identify the man, but somehow they forgot. It's no use, they thought. After all, the village had hardly developed. A good man, we need him. Christopher didn't remember his former life. It was his fate. Scarlett nursed Christopher back to health. She had fallen madly in love with him. He, too, was enchanted by this extraordinary, caring girl of fabulous beauty. In time, Christopher began to talk. He turned out to be a jack of all trades. He quickly learned to build, put up a log cabin for his own Scarlett, and furnished it. And so they lived together. Vague pictures of the past surfaced, but nothing made sense. With some secret excitement, he looked at the frost, and then all was eclipsed by lethargy. The memories went no further. Christopher was no longer himself. He was given a new name, William, slipped the papers of a long-dead man, buried but not registered as dead. William Davidovich Redfill was born. For a long time he couldn't remember where he came from, who he worked for, or why he was on that road. And Julia was still waiting for her son's return. Her motherly heart told her he was alive. It had been 5 years since his disappearance. Christopher had been reported missing. The bleak days dragged on. It seemed as if nothing would happen until she died. Then one day she received a letter. A very strange message came from the village of Chaslevoy from Linda. On a white sheet of paper was written only one word: monkey. What nonsense. Julia shook the envelope. Nothing more than that. A gap. On the window, the sheet was blank. "That's what I said. She's a mad fool," she muttered. That same day she left for the village. The first thing she did was to go to Linda's house. She didn't remember at all her son's story about how he met his wife. This time the door to the house was thrown open wide. It was empty inside. Julia walked through the rooms. It didn't look like anyone lived here. Dust, cobwebs, the smell of damp in the corners. A long, uninhabited dwelling. But in the midst of this emptiness, on the windowsill stood a tattered portrait of a sweet little girl. Julia shuddered and cried. Christopher's bottomless blue eyes were staring at her. She grabbed the portrait, read the inscription at the bottom, Mary, on the back, Mary Christopher Redfield. Can't be. How could it be? For 5 years I've been alone, with my granddaughter growing up next to me. All because of Linda, the village witch. All because of her. She took away my son and hid my granddaughter. What a bastard. Julia howled as she stared at the photograph, stroking the face that bore the features of her precious Christopher. Then she sat down and burst into tears. Tears of remorse flowed in streams. It was she herself who had kicked the good girl out without complaint. She had given her wormwood to keep her from becoming a mother. But what a cruel fate. Linda gave her a daughter and took everything away from her. It's karma. Linda shouldn't have treated her like that. It was getting dark. There was no electricity in the house, so this wasn't where her sister-in-law lived. Julia stood up from the floor, frozen for 5 years, her heart bleeding. Anxious thoughts lingered. She walked to her mother's house. Here, too, the door was thrown open wide. No one inside, empty and desolate. She hadn't been to her hometown of Sunset Valley in a year. She'd given up hope of finding her son and stopped calling. Without her, her mother must have died. No one else in the world. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry." "Where are you?" Julia said, clutching her temples, and fell senseless. She woke up in the dark. The door was cold. She had to find her granddaughter and ask Linda what was wrong with her mother. There was no electricity in the house. She went into the kitchen. As they had been when she was a child, candles lay in a drawer. Julia lit one, set down a glass, and sat alone in the semi-darkness in the chair where she had sat as a small, carefree, mischievous girl 45 years ago, the glare playing on the wall. The silence was incredible. The world froze here in an instant. Not rushed, not demanding sacrifice. What had happened to her soul? The city had taken everything good out of her, made her a cruel city girl. And it's not square meters, water from the tap that you need to stay alive. That's the feeling when you realize you're a real person. Only the countryside can reveal the soul. Julia should have been born again. Sitting alone on that chair in the semi-darkness, where her mother had not thrown it away because she had waited all her life for her daughter's return. In that moment she came home with her whole soul. The grief helped to make sense of the emptiness of her meaningless life in those short hours, as if counting down the time of rebirth. Night had fallen. Business had to be postponed until tomorrow. Julia unraveled her black braid and brushed it out. In the morning she woke with the dawn. Anxiously she opened the closet in her former room, went through the dresses she had worn when she was young. This was where she had lived until she was married, until she met a promising boyfriend who had become a lawyer. Later they had already left the village, bought an apartment in the city. The clothes were too small. Julia slammed the closet doors. She went into her mother's room, pulled back the closet. There were rows and rows of weekend dresses, all in perfect order, on parade, even the perfume still on. It was an old habit of her mother's to walk around the village only in skirts or dresses. Julia stood in indecision. Taking her mother's things, Julia didn't dare. It wasn't clear what had happened. It was bad luck to wear the belongings of the deceased. But surely she would have been informed if her mother had died. With that thought in mind, she cheerfully selected a plain, straight-cut monochrome dress and changed, taking off her pantsuit she had arrived in. Angrily, she tossed the suit into the dresser. Like a frog, she took off her skin, transforming herself into a beautiful maiden. Julia was a slender, beautiful woman in her 50s, but her strict outfits and dark clothes made her look old. Now she was happily fidgeting in front of the mirror, as if she were a dozen years younger in this simple, old-fashioned dress. It was time to make inquiries, stock up on groceries, and get the house in order. She went out into the street. The wonderful country air made her dizzy. After standing, enjoying the silence, Julia walked to the next house. She wondered why she hadn't thought to go there earlier in the evening. "Hello, Rosemary," said the old landlady when she saw Julia in her neighbor's dress. "Have a good day to you too?" Silence, continued the old lady. "Tell me, where's my mother? With a daughter like that, you can't die. Fate, it can't be. You, my dear, do not deserve to know the truth," said the neighbor harshly, turning away. "Tell me, I beg you very much, is she alive?" Rosemary stood up, picked up her club, and walked to the porch. The silence lengthened. "She's alive. You get out of here. I have nothing more to say. Don't come here. I won't say anything else. It's up to you to decide how you want to live your life." "Dylan," I shouted loudly, "we'll send Peggy out to graze, and we'll send this one out too," she muttered under her breath, but Julia heard her. She had accomplished nothing more. Dylan, the neighbor's son, passed by without looking or speaking. Julia stood for a moment, then angrily strode away. She passed 5 other neighbors. 2 had already left the village. Their houses were boarded up, their vegetable gardens abandoned, all overgrown with grass in the height of summer. The other 2 neighbors she knew couldn't explain anything, saying that her mother had moved away, but she wouldn't say where. But the village was thriving. A new store had opened. People were farming, putting the cattle out to pasture. The hospital was working. On the local bulletin board, there was a poster advertising a recreation center by the river. The villagers' inquiries were fruitless. Julia decided she had to make a fresh start. Not for nothing received a strange message: the portrait of her granddaughter will change, earn forgiveness. Fate. The girl laughed at her. She decided to start with a temporary move. I rented an apartment in the city, put it on the alarm system. That way she wouldn't have to worry. But she didn't take almost any things with her. Her old taste seemed unacceptable for the countryside. Julia went to the stores and bought suitable clothes for work and everyday life. She spent the rest of the evening tidying up the household, going through the kitchen utensils. Everything was in a poor state of repair. The old things were old. The wallpaper had not been changed for years. Now she realized how much worse the house was in need of repair. She hadn't thought about it, leaving her mother alone in the village. She only threw in a pittance occasionally, sending money a couple times a year. How her mother lived here alone was incomprehensible. And a bitter thought befell the negligent daughter. What if her son had left her alone like that? Would it be easy for her to live? Her heart was troubled. How could she do such a thing? No, she deserved everything that had happened to her. You can't be selfish, thinking only of yourself. Everything will be different now, she proclaimed into the void, wiping away her tears. Julia spent the rest of the evening cleaning the house. She made a list of things to buy in town. Figured she'd go to the village hall to find out when her mother had last paid the light bill. It turned out that the bills had been paid only 3 months ago. The landlady herself came to Linda's house, and she was treated warily, but the payment was accepted. In the evening, the electricity came on, illuminating the rooms with a cold, dim light. In the morning, Julia packed for the city. She drove her car to the village, leaving it at the gate for the night. But after thinking for a while, she went to her neighbor's house, snuck into the house, knocked. It was open. The house was clean, spacious, everything was in order. Her son had done his best to repair the house. Julia felt ashamed that she had never helped anyone. The angry landlady was about to send her away. "Rosemary, I'm sorry. I was mean. It was my fault," Julia said. "What a sly fox," grinned the neighbor. "I won't tell you anything. You know you're right. It's too early to forgive your mother. I must find my son and granddaughter. Before them I am guilty. So why did you come to me? Go back to your place. No one needs you here." "I've decided to stay here for the summer. I've been invited," Julia muttered quietly, remembering the letter from her. "What do you want?" "I'm going into town to do some repairs on my mother's house. I came here to ask if there's anything you need to buy." "Buy whatever Rosemary decides," the neighbor smirked slyly. "What are you from the bottom of my heart? Can I help you?" "Oh, my dear," suddenly smiled neighbor. "I can't pretend to be angry for long. Come to me. I babysat you while your mother was at work." To her great amazement, all of her aunt's admitted sternness did not go away. She hugged Julia, wiping away her tears. "Wait till I write you a list. And I have to ask my son. He wanted to go to town too. Maybe he could come with you." Rosemary's son was a little older than Julia. As children, they were friends and quarrelsome, annoying each other with various mischief. At 15, Dylan left his mother and went to school to become an electrician. Then he came back, got a job here, got married, made an addition to the house. We had a household, we lived together. How painful it was for her mother to see it. Her daughter got married and never came back. Hey, Dylan. Julia finally found the right words. Hi from the hatch. Dylan smiled, remembering her past offenses. Come on, don't bring up old times. I'm going to town. Your mother made a list. Maybe you should go too. Will you come with me? You're not at the robbery, Julia said. The irony was uncalled for. When she was a kid, she'd thrown herself behind the wheel of his motorcycle, but she'd lost control. Drove off a bridge into a river, and they were rescued. They banned the bike. Dylan didn't forgive her for that and stopped talking to her altogether. He'd do little things, like scare me with caterpillars or throw mice. Don't worry, I've been driving for 20 years, said Rosemary. My husband gave me a car for my wedding, and I learned right away. And you buried your husband? Dylan asked. My mother told me. God rest his soul. I'm sorry. What you reminded? Rosemary sighed. Nothing. Where did your wife die? Went out on the ice in the spring, trying to rinse her laundry. It sucked her in. She wasn't rescued, Dylan said quietly. Dylan said quietly, looking away. I'm sorry, I didn't realize it was a long time ago. Let's go to town. Wait, I've changed. While Dylan was getting ready, a girl with a bag over her shoulder ran up to Linda. Hello. Do you live in this house? Yeah, I'm here to see my mother. Yeah, here's a letter to this address. Sign here, please. Thank you, girl. Come and visit if you have time. I have to go. Goodbye. On the light-colored envelope was her mother's address, but it was addressed to Julia. Julia opened it anxiously. Was someone trying to teach her a lesson or take revenge? On the white sheet of paper in large letters was a single word, wormwood. Julia shrieked, dropped the sheet. Linda had learned that her mother-in-law's evil deeds could have left her barren. How could that be? Could she have peeked at her while Linda was in the kitchen making herbal tea for her daughter-in-law? What are you standing there for? You got your mouth open? Dylan asked, approaching and seeing the leaf. He picked it up, reading the strange message in amazement. What is this nonsense? Did you get a letter? Your correspondent is obviously not very verbal. Dylan laughed, but quickly stopped, seeing that Julia stood in a daze with a lost look. Let's go. The road was silent. They didn't even turn on the music. Dylan dozed in the passenger seat, then opened his eyes. Your mother came to see us a week ago. What? Julia braked hard, almost hitting Dylan's forehead. She's feeling better. You guys get in. I'd rather walk. You're being a bit of a jerk. I'm sorry. But why didn't Aunt Rosemary tell me? I was so worried. Do you know what I've been through? I've already buried her in my mind. Don't yell. What's going on? Julia said it quietly, pulling over to the curb. I don't know. They were whispering in the kitchen without me. And my mother forbade me to talk about it. Don't ask me anything. I'm gonna go, Linda said. Here we go. Wait. I'll find out for myself. Don't say anything. Let's go. The shopping trip took longer than they thought. It was getting dark by the time they filled the trunk and the back seats. Julia talked Dylan into spending the night at her apartment. He walked around the rooms for a long time, looking amazed. It's like a museum. What kind of place is this? You must be crazy to live in the country. There's a living room as big as your mother's house. Yes, my mother lives in poverty and my daughter lives in luxury. Patricia's herding the flock is marvelous. Dylan, I know everything. Calm down, Julia stopped him. You'll sleep on the couch. Come on. I'll feed you, but I won't give you caviar. I'll feed you, you furry hedgehog. Dylan replied playfully. Julia thought that it was unbearable to live alone. Caring for others gave her energy. Dylan was thoughtful, looking at his mistress with respect. The evening was not going well. The guest was obviously hiding something from her, but Linda didn't ask any more. The letters led her to some goal, like stages of tests she had to pass. In the early morning, Dylan got up, lifting Julia. He never left his mother alone for long. He had to help with the chores. They came back when the neighbor had already put the cow out to graze. "Why didn't you come back yesterday? Every hour counts. I can't cope anymore. And it's getting scary to spend the night alone," the neighbor said. And then she smiled and invited us to tea. They unloaded the shopping. Julia brought a set of pots and pans as a gift for her neighbor. She knew that cookware is the main problem of village housewives. Rosemary went to deny, but accepted the gift. The hut was clean, cozy, warm. The hostess brewed tea, put a film with lambs, jam, and honey. A quiet morning in the village, peaceful. Julia sipped her tea. She looked at her hostess with bewilderment, remembering something. "And I suppose you were bitter. I suppose others had a sweet life? Remember that with wormwood?" Julia choked. Rosemary was coughing and crying. "You eat it with jam from the freezer. You eat it with jam from the freezer. It'll be less bitter," she said with a sly squint. Julia shuddered. Tears ran down her cheeks, and she jumped up and ran out without looking at anyone. This had never happened before. Nothing disturbed her heart. She had easily done mischief to her sister-in-law. But now a long dormant conscience woke up and troubled her soul. Julia sat on the bench at the gate and could not calm down for a long time. There were no thoughts in her head, only tears flowed unrestrainedly, washing away the blackness that lived in her soul. Nancy's granddaughter was to take away the bitterness of life. A little while later, Julia began to unpack. Then she fiddled in the kitchen until evening, took everything out to the veranda, painted the ceiling and walls, deciding to wallpaper. She just mopped the floors. She had a rug, contrary to village tradition. The old kitchen furniture was falling apart, needing repair. Julia persuaded Dylan to help, who willingly patched the holes. He's a real piece of work. In his 50s and early 50s, he's still got the skill to work with his hands, Julia said with admiration. Dylan laughed at the carpet and told him to paint the floors. "You can help me organize the furniture. It's up to me to decide what to do. You city folk are all cuckoo." Linda dismissed him. "Oh, for crying out loud. All right, let the carpet be for now, and I'll have the floors repainted later. You'll throw that carpet away in 3 days. Let's see how hot you get at the river. I bought a vacuum cleaner. You've never even heard of it?" Dylan gave Linda a friendly look, a playful nudge, a playful look. "Oh, Dylan, stop pushing me around. Oh, Dylan, stop pushing me around. We don't have time for that. We have grandchildren to babysit." "You didn't let me babysit my former grandchildren," he said bitterly. "The son of a border guard, he doesn't show his nose at home. It's been 10 years since we've seen each other." "Son, I don't know anything about you. I don't know about anyone. I took care of myself. Only my son is left. After his mother died, he cut off all contact with us. He left, as if he disappeared into thin air. He writes letters once a year. What's wrong with that? He's made his own arrangements. He got an apartment in the Far East. But he didn't have a family," Julia said pityingly and hugged Dylan. He suddenly responded, hugged her and kissed her on the lips. Linda was taken aback. "Are you crazy in your old age? You don't know anything. I was in love with you when I was a kid, and Madeline, the town freak, was the first one to jump on me. I don't need any more help from you. I'll see you around," Dylan muttered. He turned and walked away. "Right, you're going to teach them a lesson, aren't you?" Linda called out to him. "What's mine?" Wait, you can't talk here. Dylan came up to Julia, kissed her again, and quickly left. She stood in a daze for a minute, then sat down to drink tea in the newly transformed kitchen, sparkling clean. Dylan had hung the chandelier she'd envisioned, installed a floor clock with a pendulum on the wall, adding to the coziness. Only the old set spoiled the overall impression. So the furniture was worth updating. Linda could order new sofas, a wall, an armchair, a bed for her mom. How easy were these things to do now? Why hadn't she thought about Mom's comfort before? For a week, Julia made repairs, ordered furniture. While she waited for delivery, she painted the ceilings and walls. For more than 10 years, she sat on the couch with soap operas, and now she worked, impressing the neighbors, unprecedented for a mature woman's vigor. Her back and arms ached in the evenings, but Julia didn't complain. She endured, glad that God had given her the strength for such an important work. During that week, Dylan visited her more than once, helping with cabinet repairs and rearranging furniture. Julia got used to him, communication became warm, he often stayed late. They remembered the past, made plans. But about Linda's mother, Dylan refused to talk. At parting, he hugged her like his own, but he did not allow himself any liberties, kissing her innocently on the cheek. On the 8th day, the renovation was finished. The old cabinets from the kitchen were dismantled for firewood. For her mother, Julia chose non-tarnished furniture of a pleasant gray shade, which gave the kitchen a new glow. The house sparkled with magical colors, with new furniture, fluffy carpets. Julia put all her energies into the renovation and, exhausted of energy, fell asleep on the new sofa. She woke up to a knock on the door. The postmistress Patricia came. The game was dragging on. The family sent a package. Julia opened it anxiously. This time there was no message, just 2 jars with some contents. She opened it carefully, tasted it. Wormwood and the same thing. It's a vicious circle. I chose the right path as a mother a long time ago. I did the repairs. I realized what a despicable thing I'd done to my family. I lost my son. Tell me, haven't we suffered enough? Didn't we? I'm sorry, it's early. It's early, Julia said. Didn't you understand? Came Dylan's voice. Didn't you lock the door? They're going to steal my beauty. Scared you? Linda flinched. The door? Oh, that doesn't make any sense. What didn't I realize? You have to lock the door. That's not what I meant. You just said you didn't get it. Are you all kidding me? Nobody. You did this all yourself. You did all this renovation. If you don't want to tell me, don't tell me. Just go. Don't make a mess. I'm here. We need help with the household chores. My mom asked me to. All right, I'll come back in an hour. Dylan stomped around for a while and came out. Julia made breakfast, working out in her head the problem she'd been given. If Linda knows about her intrigues, Julia has to go through it too. First to feel the bitterness of life, and then there would be hope and a path in the distance. Her granddaughter Svetlova kept saying, and drank the jar of wormwood infusion to the bottom. She choked, took a drink of water, and collapsed without feeling. By evening, Dylan found Julia sleeping soundly in the kitchen. There was no way to wake her. He carried her to the hall and put her on the sofa. Linda looked charming in her sleep. Dylan decided to stay close to her, to wait for her to wake up, so he locked the door. He went into the kitchen. His eye caught a jar of some kind of potion. He sniffed something familiar. He remembered the inscription in the letter he'd recently received. Wormwood. Dylan thought that Julia's mother had continued the punishment, but he wouldn't interfere. Let things run their course. They say Julia herself had been scheming against her daughter-in-law for 1.5 years, playing with her fate and her relationship with her son. Dylan turned off the light and lay down on the bed in the bedroom. He fell asleep quickly, a sound, healthy sleep. Julia woke up when there was deep darkness outside the window. She was surprised that she had no memory of the previous day at all. Opening her eyes, Julia squealed with horror. There was a dark silhouette standing on her doorstep. She ran to the bedroom, closed the door, sighed, looked at the bed, and a scream caught in her throat. In the semi-darkness, she saw Linda sitting with her legs overhung. She was pointing her finger, whispering that Julia had ruined her unborn children. Linda fell to her knees. "I'm sorry," Linda, the frightened woman, pleaded. "I pray to God. I'm guilty everywhere, but I don't hold a grudge." An ominous silence was her answer. When Julia looked up in fear, she saw that there was no Linda, but a man sleeping on the bed. She jumped up, a pounding in her temples. Her head was spinning. She listened in silence. It was only when she looked out into the living room that she realized there was no one there. Turning on the bedroom light, Julia breathed a sigh of relief. "Dylan, how you frightened me." But he was sleeping soundly as a baby, not awakened by her cries. Turning off the light, Julia went into the kitchen. There was still someone standing at the threshold, a dark silhouette. It walked quickly toward Julia. Dazed with horror, she skidded back into the bedroom, but there stood her mother with an angry expression on her face, moved her whole body, approaching, threatening her with her finger. "Why did you have children, you naughty daughter? You've ruined everyone's life. You yourself are wearing silk. You didn't think about your mother." "Mommy, don't." "I'm sorry, don't swear, I'll fix it. Everything will be different," Julia begged. Her mother had almost reached her and held out her hands. Dylan woke up. He saw Julia staring into the void and whispering in a frantic plea for forgiveness. "Julia, what are you doing?" She finally saw that there was no one in the room but Dylan. His shout cleared her eyes, but the fear remained. "There's someone in the hallway," Julia whispered. "You're a mess," Dylan said, shaking his head. "You should take less of that stuff." "Why did you take wormwood last night?" "Wormwood doesn't give you visions. It was spiked." "That's right. And you knocked over the second bottle," Linda said. Julia flinched. Linda was talking to her. Monkeys eat." Linda laughed. "Oh my God, I'm imagining things again. Do you have a headache?" "Impossible," Julia said. "Let's go to Mommy. She'll tell you what to do. Take the jar." Julia obediently got ready. She could still hear footsteps in the house. Shadows seemed to lurk in the corners. She fumbled around, grabbing Dylan's arm. Without letting go of him, they came to Rosemary's room. She picked up the jar, took it, and laughed. "Well, my dear, how long will you dream of things? A mushroom for a mushroom. That's what you should have called the potion." Rosemary laughed again, but sat the guests down. She fiddled with the herbs and poured some fragrant tea. "Here, drink this. It'll make you feel better." "You must have a headache," she said to Julia. "Thank you." "I hope it doesn't make me quite," Julia mumbled. "If you don't want to, don't drink and get out of here," Rosemary said sharply. "Why are you acting so strangely? You're persecuting me and helping me." "Julia, remember the main truth: everything can be forgiven, but guilt in front of an innocent child cannot atone." At home, Dylan gave Julia a lecture, said that today he would not babysit her. He would come back in the evening. The woman entered the house anxiously, not noticing anything suspicious. Her head ached hardly at all. She felt like going to sleep. Julia fell asleep quickly, barely putting her head on the pillow. She was awakened by her own voice. "Hello, daughter." Her mother was sitting on the edge of the couch. "Mommy, hello, hello. How I missed you," Julia exclaimed. "How beautiful you've made it. Would you have done it before?" "It was so nice," replied her mother. "Mom, I'm sorry," Julia cried, and tried to get up but couldn't. She forcefully crawled on the couch and opened her eyes. The whole pillow was wet. There was no one in the house. "I was dreaming," she whispered. "But Mom, we'll meet. In fact, I'll change everything." Her head was still heavy, dizzy and aching in her temples. Julia walked to the kitchen, took a jar of jam, tasted it automatically, struggled to do her household chores. Having moved, she decided to cook something tasty, to make pies to treat Dylan in the evening. She had a secret liking for her neighbor Christopher. He was as at ease with her as if he were her own. After an hour, she was surprised to note that her headache was gone and her consciousness was clear. A burst of strength and appetite reminded her that she was quite well. "Monkey helped monkey, because after the tea I had dreams," Julia said. Julia started a new phase of her life and decided to find something to do to keep busy. She used to work for her husband at the prosecutor's office as a secretary. Together with Christopher's father, they had made a fortune and had become respected people in the city. But now Julia realized that no luxury could replace family. The longing for her son, the desire to see her granddaughter and meet her mother had become the main value of her life. It was getting dark. Julia cooked goodies and waited for Dylan to arrive. Then she got angry and decided to go to bed. There was a knock at the door, but instead of a neighbor came a girl who handed Julia an envelope and disappeared. This made Julia angry. She wanted to throw the letter away, but she overpowered herself, sat down and printed the message. "There are many roads to redemption, but unfortunately not all of them are peaceful," Julia read aloud. "Sounds like a threat." "It's my job to scare you," came a man's voice over her ear. "Who's there?" Julia shrieked in horror and jumped up sharply. Dylan laughed. "You're sincerely making fun of me," Julia rebuked him. "Did you do it on purpose? I was baking you pies. You're not getting any. Get out of here. I'm an old woman, I have nerves. I have a weak heart. If I don't live to see my son and granddaughter, you'll be responsible for this sin. Just so you know, mark my words." "You just cursed me," Dylan grinned. "You should close the door. What's the fashion for you to swoop in like a witch? I'll go. Good night, mad woman." Wait. Sit down, eat. Woof. What are you doing?" "Well, you give me as a dog commands." Julia was outraged. "Okay, sorry, I'm kidding. Get your pies." "Okay, but don't scare me again. Next time, I'm sure I'll give my soul to God without fail." "You've got another 30 years on you," Dylan laughed. "What kind of treatment is that? Are there no other words for me?" "There are, but you'll like them even less," Dylan replied. "Shut up. It's scary to imagine what's going on in your head," Dylan said with a sudden change of tone. Then he added with a smirk, "You, my love, are like a splinter in my head." Julia choked on her tea and coughed up tears. She wanted to say something. Instead, she sat silently, her eyes wide. "You're out of your mind," Dylan grumbled. He hadn't expected such a reaction. He wanted mutual recognition, a warm relationship. He wanted Julia to lower her eyes demurely, take his hand, and tell him that she needed him. An indignant Dylan jumped up and ran outside. Julia straightened up in her chair. She hadn't expected such a reaction from herself. She considered herself a reserved lady. Where did she get this country bumpkin attitude from? Silly, she thought. The next morning, ashamed to remember last night, Julia fulfilled the promise she had made to herself. Before lunch, she went around the city looking for work. Everywhere she was offered only temporary help in the household. Then she resolutely went home and changed her clothes. Redemption is what was needed, she repeated to herself the words of the letter. The first thing Julia did was to stop by Rosemary's house and help her with the vegetable garden. Then she went around to the neighbors to make life easier for the elderly. She didn't take money for her work. and she refused to buy food. It was dark when Julia returned home. Her back ached, but she felt happy. For the first time in days, she felt proud. As she approached the porch, she heard some rustling behind the house. A dark figure. Was she imagining it? Deciding to see what was there, Julia took a few steps and suddenly fell into a hole. She hit her head on something hard and lost consciousness. When she woke up, Julia couldn't tell what time of day it was. It was completely dark. She twisted her head around and tried to get up. When she hit something, she shrieked and felt around, and there were wooden walls everywhere, with planks on top. She was trapped in some kind of box. A cold, sickening feeling of fear and hopelessness scared Julia to death. "Help me! Help me! Help me! Help me!" she screamed, hysterical. It seemed to her as if an eternity had passed, and at last her body quieted. Her head was splitting with pain. Taking a full breath, Julia calmed down. She remembered the words of the letter. Not all paths to redemption are peaceful. "This is too much, too much. You can't torture a man like this. You can't," Julia screamed and cried, pounding on the walls of the box. Then she noticed that the lid was sliding open. Julia put her hands and head against it and with an effort opened it. The daylight blinded her eyes, which were unaccustomed to brightness. She blinked, then stood up. Her heart nearly stopped with horror. She was standing in a grave, in a coffin, in a cemetery. Gathering her last strength, Julia began to climb out of the grave. At that time, an inebriated watchman came running to her screams. When he saw someone climbing out of the grave, he almost had a stroke. But he still ran up and managed to push Julia back when she was almost out. "Damn zombie. You've got a heart, but you've got an ugly face. Where did your kin put you?" muttered the watchman. Despair seized the unhappy woman, but she guessed to speak calmly. "Grandfather, grandfather," she cautiously called the watchman. "This is the work of the evil power. Lord, forgive me sinful, I repent. I swear I won't drink anymore. Grandfather, I'm alive, I fell here. I came to visit my family, and here's this open grave. Grandpa, help me, please." "Cunning, pretending to be a human being," said the watchman cautiously. He looked into the grave and saw Julia in black work clothes, with her hair tangled and loose. "Help me, you idiot, you damned bastard. Help me out of here. Get me out of here at once," Julia whispered in helplessness, like a hiss. "Holy Mother of God," the guard exclaimed fearfully and ran away, making the sign of the cross. "Go on, you heartless man. Get out yourself," he said. At the third attempt, Julia got out of the grave. The cemetery was deserted, with a field beyond. A narrow path led somewhere. But where was the village? It was hard to figure out. The paths to redemption are far from peaceful. How did I even end up here? How could anyone do this to a living person? Julia pondered. She sat down by the roadside and began brushing her hair, which seemed to be purposely knotted and tangled in the ominous silence of the cemetery. Thoughts of life and death came into her head. Here is the end of everyone's life, the grave. How much of us is empty, unnecessary, superfluous? And all of us have the same end in a hole under the ground. Lying on the damp earth, Julia thought, as long as I'm alive, I need to think about more than just myself. She didn't cry. She just accepted it. Washed, go down that path over there, as if the road was telling her. Or to a new life one must pass. Maybe this is the path of redemption, not a peaceful one. Mommy, Mommy, tell me, you're the one who played games with me. How could you do this to me?" Julia knew the answer. She had forgotten the way to her mother's house. It was time to return to the place where her soul would be born again. In her mind, she forgave her mother for everything. It was important to go through this redemption, any hardship. It was necessary to beg forgiveness. The path led to the road, but no one passed by. After 15 minutes, Julia was exhausted. She was thirsty. Her legs ached. She sat down on the side of the road to wait for a car. A tractor showed up. By a fateful coincidence, Max was behind the wheel. He agreed to give Julia a ride to the village for a small fee. As she sat down next to him, she breathed a sigh of relief. Then she noticed a familiar backpack at his feet. Julia leaned over and was horrified to see the secret embroidery on the strap, which she herself had custom-made for her son. "Explain at once where you got that from?" she asked sharply, stopping the tractor. "I found this backpack by the roadside, picked it up." "It was a long time ago," Max replied. "I don't remember when. Tell me the truth." Julia slapped the driver. Max did not tolerate it, got out and threw the woman out of the tractor with force, and then drove away. Julia made her way to the village in tears. She was determined to find out about the backpack. The hope of finding her son loomed ahead. His backpack was here, which meant Liam was coming not far away. He and Linda must be messing with me, Julia thought. When she got home, she locked herself in the dark and fell into a heavy, restless sleep. Dylan came to her more than once, but he couldn't get through to her. Julia woke for the first time late in the afternoon. She heated water and washed herself properly. She ate with appetite. Life was coming back to her. The apathy of the last few days had subsided. Julia got dressed and picked up her papers, deciding to go to the police station. "Hello. 5 years ago, my son went to the village of Rodnoy but never returned. Wait. The officers on duty will call the district police officer to you and make a statement with him," Julia was told. An hour later, the woman was invited to the office. "Hello, Kevin. This is the district commissioner." "What do you want to see us about?" the man asked. Julia detailed the events of 5 years ago and described yesterday's incident with the backpack. She was asked to write a statement and promised to look into it. In the evening, she received a phone call and was told to come to the station. They refused to search for her. No good. "Here's a brand new backpack with no embroidery." They searched the house, found nothing, Kevin said, showing the backpack. A clever man figured out what was going on. He got rid of his son's things, burned them in the backyard. Julia got nowhere. The trail went cold, but she didn't take a statement. "Your Liam's missing," the precinct officer said harshly, shooing the woman away. But Julia didn't give up. She decided to turn to Dylan for help. She needed to nail Max to the wall, but the neighbor refused to help. "Are you crazy? Just live in peace. Everything will work itself out." "Don't you understand? That's my son's backpack. I haven't seen him in 5 years. This bastard's obviously up to something. If you don't help me, I'll go to him myself." "You can't stop. And anyway, where were you yesterday? Wandering around the vegetable gardens again?" "Yes, I was helping. Digging underground." Julia didn't want to say anything to scare Dylan. "I'll be honest, it's a great distraction from my darkest thoughts." They stood in the doorway, embracing each other as if they were young, with all the burdens lifted from their shoulders. People who had passed the test, forgiven each other for the present and the past. Dylan and Julia made no secret of their relationship. Rosemary took it calmly, only told them to help with household chores as before. 2 days after the cemetery came a new message. Julia was already waiting for it. She opened it without excitement. It was a postcard with an invitation to visit the vacation home by the river. Dylan took the news calmly. Rosemary sighed mysteriously, smiled imperceptibly. They both knew the landlady of this inn. Julia was waiting for the last test. No matter how much she begged, Dylan refused to go with her and remained adamant. Julia hastily packed, took the invitation card and set off on her journey. It was a short drive, about an hour on a country road. Then the path changed, and it became more difficult to drive in the field. Every now and then the car bounced on the bumps. Finally they arrived. The rest house, which occupied an impressive space, appeared. Several hunting lodges and a 2-story building were located along the river. At the gate, the guard let Julia through without question. Pulling into the grounds, she read the name. In bright red letters on the hull, it read Morocco. 5 years ago, Linda Svetlova found herself on the street because of her mother-in-law's sneaky schemes. The biggest blow was the betrayal of her husband. He did not believe her, did not support her, threw her out as a mean woman. Linda couldn't bear it. Her heart was broken. There was no point in living any longer. Without a shadow of a doubt, she stepped into the road, but a man passing nearby pushed her away a second before the irreparable happened. Linda's head was only slightly bumped, but she was still taken to the hospital. The doctor told the unbelievable news the girl was pregnant. Only this saved Linda from the terrible pain in her heart. She wiped her tears and decided to live against fate. Linda did not want to return to her husband. She could not forgive his betrayal. There was only one way left to her homeland, to her native village. When she returned, she put the house in order and cried for 5 days after being locked up. She had to organize her life for the sake of her child. Linda pulled herself together. She went into town, quit her job at the store. Peggy, Christopher's grandmother, the same Maria Ilinichna, met Linda at the store and told her to tell the truth. They were more than just neighbors. Linda often helped Peggy in the household, came to visit her. The girl became family to this woman. But Julia did not know this and did not see beyond her nose. In the evening, pregnant Linda could not resist and told Peggy for a long time what she had been through for a year and a half. The neighbor cried, unable to believe her own daughter's meanness. Then the old woman took Linda in to help her through this difficult time. The girl got a job in a bakery and managed to help her patroness. When Julia came looking for traces or news, her sister-in-law was in the next room. She was also the one who bribed the villagers to make her mother-in-law think Linda had not returned to the village. Not for a second did the daughter-in-law feel sorry for her mother-in-law, but the news about Christopher alarmed her. She began to search for him. Her first attempts to find her husband proved futile. 7 months later, Linda gave birth to a daughter and named her Madeline. One day, walking on the bank of the river, the girl thought how good it is in the village to rest from the city. After all, it is a very good idea to build a house on the shore so that the townspeople could rest in it. This thought she shared with Peggy. To Peggy's great surprise, she brought the whole 2 million wrapped in a dish towel. Wow. How did you get so rich? I've been saving. You know, Julia used to give me money like a dog. I couldn't spend it. She didn't set eyes on me for 5 years. Christopher used to come and leave me some money too. I'd save it up. I'd give it to a good cause or a church. I don't need anything myself. Take it. I'm sorry to you. I've been suffering because of my daughter. Thank you, Linda said. It's not just for me, it's for you and a good cause. After consulting a lawyer from the city, Linda got a permit and bought a plot of land by the river. The first house came out small. At first, she didn't think it would be anything worthwhile. She advertised in town and people showed up. They bought places 2 months in advance. A year later, they built 2 two-story buildings and added hunting cabins. The demand did not fall, and the profit grew. For the summer, Linda and her grandmother moved to a cabin built especially for them. All the while, the girl continued her search. She knew that Christopher never came home. He had been expelled from his job because of his long absence. Linda traveled all over the neighborhood in search of her husband. One day she remembered the God-forsaken village of Red Lion, who lived under the name of William. Scraps recalled the past. Once he easily settled a dispute between the men, reading from the former lines from the laws. After that, the villagers began to go to him for minor matters, to secure their property by law or to formalize the land, to fill out documents. It became clear that more than just a guest was being sheltered. Over time, Christopher grew cold toward his common-law wife. An unknown anxiety overtook his soul. He went to the river all day long, wistfully remembered the same village, grandmother, paintings. The past life was gradually coming back to him. Roberta immediately realized that William began to avoid her. The stern girl packed her things and returned to her mother. Linda did not even think of returning him. He only brought suffering with his indifference. There, in the depths of memories, awoke the feeling of a mysterious girl with a basket of flowers. He saw her in a dream, walking along the road. Then all was cut short by a black cloth. So he was tormented for another 6 months in fragments, remembering the past, trying to find out where he was found. And the next day, without informing anyone of his plans, he got ready to go to the village of Rodno. In the morning he got up early, got on his motorcycle and drove away. Almost 2 years had passed since he had crashed before reaching his destination. Now he knew for sure that this journey had to be completed. That same day, Linda arrived in the village of Krasnoye. She went around 5 yards before they dared to tell her the truth about the accident. Linda was taken to Christopher's house, but no one was there. The villagers waved goodbye and invited her to visit. She could finally tell them who they had taken in. "He's from our village," they said. Christopher pulled onto the road, read the signs, looked around. Then he looked at the cars that occasionally passed by. He instantly refreshed his memories of that fateful day when a tractor had driven into him on this very spot. "Linda," a sharp pain stabbed at his heart. "How could you be without me?" He guessed that the whole misfortune had befallen them only because of his own mother. One planted packet of pills and a fictitious note had ruined entire families' lives. Christopher took a long time to come to his senses, hesitant to continue on his way. He walked between the trees, climbing out of the abyss he'd been living in for the past 2 years. It was like coming out of a coma. Finally, he decided to go to his grandmother to cheer and comfort her. It seemed to him that an eternity had passed. When he reached the doorstep of his grandmother, he ran into the veranda. Toward him, hearing the motorcycle, Peggy ran out. Both were crying and laughing. "Christopher, you're alive, sweetheart. I believed you'd come back, that you were alive," she exclaimed. "Let me look at you. You've grown up so much, and I'm still the same as my grandmother." "Don't cry. It's all right. Everything will be different now," answered Christopher. "And you rascal, how could you torture us for 2 years? Didn't your heart ache? Didn't you feel sorry for your family?" "I just remembered you today. Grandma, where's Linda? Did she come looking for you?" "You don't know anything," Peggy said, and led him into the house. Christopher saw a little girl looking at him with clear blue eyes. "Daughter," he breathed out and choked back bitter tears. "I kicked out my pregnant wife. For 2 years she was alone without me." The girl shook her uncle's hand and ran off to play. She did not immediately get used to strangers, brought up by her mother and grandmother. She was too young to understand the complexities of life. "Where's Linda? Did she go looking for you?" "She's been looking all the time. She went to Red," Peggy said. Christopher shuddered, realizing that he had missed his wife and that fate was confusing them. He decided to wait here for her return and had a long talk with his grandmother. Peggy told him bitterly, "Your mother, Julia, not only Linda, but your other girls were scared away from you, from your son. She once even confessed in a fit of despair how she had separated you from Linda, how she had written that letter in your name, how she wanted to make her infertile." Christopher could hardly believe his mother had arranged such meanness. A lump came to his throat. He shouldn't have believed his wife, defending his mother. Because of her, he almost lost the life of his wife and daughter. "Granny, you can't let it go. You can't let it go. You can't. I don't want to see her again. I don't want to know her. Linda returned late that night. As she approached the house, she saw Christopher's motorcycle, burst into tears, and rushed into the house. Linda rushed in and threw herself around Christopher's neck because she knew her lover had not betrayed her. Peggy ran to her mother and began beating Christopher with her palms, afraid that her uncle would hurt her mother. They decided to all live together, but they moved into a vacation home that needed owner supervision. Peggy stayed on, promising to move in with her grandson and great-granddaughter later. The vacation home prospered, growing. Christopher's help proved invaluable. With the property properly registered, they expanded and ran the business wisely. Christopher called his daughter Baby and spent all his free time with her. The girl loved her father and became attached to him with all her heart. For 3 more years, Christopher did not want to hear anything about his mother. Time has softened him a little, and he decided to forgive Julia. But only by changing would she be forgiven. Christopher himself devised a plan of redemption. Linda and Peggy did not immediately accept the offer to teach their mother a lesson. It seemed too cruel a way to bring Julia to her senses. What? Christopher, we've already suffered for 5 years, just like Linda lost you. Julia didn't even spare our future children, said Peggy. I never drank her poison. It was impossible to drink that stuff. Sometimes the decoction was switched, and sometimes it poured out, Christopher replied. What did she use? Wormwood. Let her drink the wormwood herself. It was like this. Christopher had been living in the house of Rosemary, a neighbor. When Julia came to the house, the son was in a room a few feet away from his mother. He was glad she was near, alive and well. But changing her character was more important than meeting her. For the time being, Peggy moved into Christopher's house at the recreation center. Christopher wrote a message, changing his handwriting beyond recognition. He wanted his mother to feel a little of what Linda had experienced. It didn't seem enough for him to just confuse her. He invented a whole epic of redemption, remorse, separation from his granddaughter, the bitterness of loneliness. Rosemary also made the frost and wormwood. The wormwood was laced with sleeping pills and hallucinogenic grapes. It seemed unnecessarily extreme. But Christopher persuaded Rosemary's neighbor that there could be no harm. The drugstore had a remedy for the poisoning, which they put in the drink. Christopher came in at night when his mother drank the wormwood concoction, worried about how she was feeling. But it turned out that the son only aggravated the situation, scaring Julia to death. The story of the repairs and help stunned Christopher. It was beyond his plans, but it was a good sign. Julia changed beyond recognition, started dating Dylan. The neighbor was against this punishment, but he couldn't change anyone's mind. Only supported Christopher in her troubles. The hardest step for the son was the story with the cemetery. But one day he cheated death himself, as if born again. He looked at everything with different eyes. He wanted his mother to feel the same way. He made a shallow hole, but forgot to put the shovel away. Julia hit her head, luckily not badly. Christopher gave her a shot with sleeping pills and took her to a pre-prepared hole in the cemetery. There was actually a man to be buried there, so the grave was dug hastily. He had made something that looked like a coffin, more like a box with a lid that could be easily removed from the inside. He had even carefully placed a pillow. Later, Christopher was horrified at what he had done, but remembering that Linda had lived in hell for 1.5 years and had almost lost her child, he calmed his conscience. He waited anxiously for his mother's return. He knew that she would be picked up by the locals on the road and that her lust for life would take its toll. Julia returned in a sorry state and then went to Kevin, the precinct commander. But Kevin knew Christopher's history and was even friends with him, taking advantage of his legal knowledge on occasion. He called Christopher beforehand and asked what to do. That way Julia didn't find out ahead of time that Christopher was alive. Perhaps the son's decision to leave his mother in the dark was too cruel. For 3 years he held a grudge. The only thing he couldn't forgive was Linda. Peggy and Grandma Rosemary softened his heart. They sympathized with him wholeheartedly. Linda and Rosemary wanted to tell Julia several times that Christopher was alive, but they did not dare to interfere. The long-awaited moment had arrived. Julia arrived at their vacation base and walked into the main building. There was no one in the lobby. An Indian tune was playing. She looked around, saw the television, and was taken aback. Pictures of her granddaughter, mother, daughter-in-law, son were changing one after another. "Christopher," she whispered quietly with tears. "Sorry, Mom," came a familiar voice from behind her. Julia turned around, saw Christopher, cried out, and collapsed. She had to call an ambulance. Later, her condition worsened, and Julia was taken to the city clinic. The woman had suffered a stroke. Christopher could not believe what was happening. Instead of a happy reunion and family reunion, he drove his mother to the hospital. Peggy, without a word, packed up and left for her home in Miami. The magical transformation of the dwelling hurt her heart. Everything had already been lovingly arranged. Her daughter Linda had performed a miracle with her own hands. The old mother sat on the new couch, thinking that Julia had recently slept there. "I forgive you, my daughter," she said tearfully. She lay down on the couch and fell asleep. She never woke up again. In the evening, Peggy was visited by Dylan as usual, but it was too late. He broke the sad news to Christopher and Linda. 3 days later, the funeral was held. Half the town was there to say goodbye to Peggy. Christopher and Linda wept uncontrollably. Their daughter Nancy screamed loudly, not understanding why her beloved grandmother was buried in the ground. A week later, Julia was discharged. Still recovering from the blow, she tried to speak, but nothing came out. She could hardly move, mumbled and cried. For the first time, the family lived at Peggy's house. Christopher dropped his mother off, gave her massages, made her exercise, and in the evenings got on his motorcycle and rode off somewhere. He couldn't forgive himself for the anger he harbored toward his mother. Whatever she is, she's still family. He himself is just as bad a person. He himself must walk the path of redemption. His mother's illness and his grandmother's death weighed heavily on Christopher's shoulders. Dylan came to Julia, took her in his arms, put her in the stroller he had bought for her, and they walked together along the river. After 2 months, Julia began to talk and walk on her own. "Dylan, I want to go home," she said. "Where to?" "To the city," Dylan asked. "And son? Granddaughter, are you with me? How can I leave my mother?" "Will you visit?" Julia asked. "We'll get her a helper." Dylan was really attached to Julia. After some thought, he agreed. The next day, while Christopher and Linda were at work, they left for the city. Christopher was informed of the move by Rosemary. She shook her head sternly, and from then on stopped all communication with him. 10 years passed. Young, beautiful Nancy, who was now jokingly called Maria Lovna, graduated from high school and entered teacher training college. Over time, Julia grew stronger, recovered. In the city, she took a rehabilitation course at the best clinic. She and Dylan moved to the country for the summer. They stayed with Christopher and Linda. Rosemary lived in the city with her son for 5 years. She passed away quietly, with God's blessing, buried next to Peggy. We were neighbors, and we still are. The family council decided that Nancy would now live in town like a queen. They entrusted her with Dylan's ancestral apartment. Julia and Dylan sold the house in the village, gathered up their savings, and traveled. Too many painful memories were here. Christopher and Linda sold Peggy's house, deciding to leave the village. They bought a condo in Miami, hired a manager for their vacation home base, and moved in. They visited their daughter almost every month until she graduated and got a job in her home village as an elementary school teacher. Julia and Dylan came to visit to see their granddaughter. They traveled to every city in the United States and then went abroad. Over time, the vacation home passed to Nancy, who stayed true to the land where she was born. Every summer she came to the cemetery with a basket of peanuts to visit her grandmother. Barbara worked as an editor at a publishing house. On another Thursday, just before lunchtime, her smartphone started ringing. On the screen, she saw the words "Mom," although calls during work were not a frequent occurrence. Barbara didn't expect anything bad. She figured her mom just missed her or wanted advice on clothing choices. Barbara answered the phone. As soon as she heard her mom's voice, she immediately knew something was wrong. The voice was strange, muffled. "Barbara, honey, don't worry, please," Mom said. "I'm at the hospital right now." "Mommy, what happened? What hospital are you in? What do the doctors say? What do you need to bring? What's the room number?" Barbara asked her questions. "Barbara, please don't worry," the voice answered. "It's just like in the movie. I slipped and fell and was passed out. But I'm fine." Gabriella, a neighbor, was walking by. She helped me and supported me while we waited for the ambulance. The doctor said I'd be fine, but I'd be in the hospital for a while. "Mom, why didn't you tell me before? Mom, why didn't you tell me? I would have rushed to help." "I didn't want to interrupt you in the middle of the day. Mom, but tonight 4 to 7 p.m. is visiting hours. I was afraid if you went home first, then to the pharmacy, you might not make it. Please write down what you need to bring. The main things are a policy, a cell phone charger, and non-carbonated water. For some reason, I'm very thirsty." Her mother sighed, and Barbara imagined her face contorted with pain. She hurried to end the conversation by asking for the number of the hospital and the room. Barbara reread the list of things her mother had dictated to her. Yes, Barbara had peed chicken broth in it and used wet wipes. And on wobbly legs, she went to ask her boss, Jack. "Please allow me to leave early today, for personal reasons. My mom's in the hospital," Barbara said. The boss, a friend of Barbara's husband's from his student days, expressed polite words of sympathy. When he learned which hospital the subordinate's mother was in, he cheered her up and asked, "But the doctors at our regional clinic are good. Maybe the atmosphere is not too luxurious, but the equipment and staff are top-notch. I've been in this hospital several times. I was discharged as good as new. So you're going to be fine. By the way, are you driving today, or is Matthew driving? Maybe Eden can give you a ride in the car." Barbara was touched by her boss's concern and decided that she was in no position to refuse. "Thank you, Jack. That would be very helpful. I'm not keeping the driver long. I just need to get to my mom's house, that's all. I won't keep Eden any longer. I'll get my things there and then call a cab. Thank you." The manager wished Barbara success and promised, "Come out in 15 minutes to the main entrance. I'll tell Eden to wait for you at your mother's house and give you a ride to your family home. He's coming back for me anyway. Is your house on the way?" Thanking her sensitive boss again, Barbara went to turn off her computer and clean up her workplace. She took the contract with her so that she wouldn't let the whole team down and complete the necessary work by the next morning. The woman badly perceived the meaning of the jokes with which the driver tried to entertain her. But even she was grateful that the flow of his speeches made her at least react somehow and prevented her from sinking into anxious thoughts. Following the list, ticking off each recorded item with a check mark, Barbara packed up her mother's apartment, watering her favorite flowers. She shut off the gas and water just in case, checked to make sure there were no perishables in the refrigerator, picked up the trash to throw out. Only then did Barbara go downstairs and set off with her driver, Eden. Not far from Barbara and Matthew's house was a supermarket with a pharmacy department inside. The woman decided to stop there on the way, asking Eden to pull over near the container yard. She threw out the garbage she had collected and rushed to get her groceries. Moving almost on autopilot, Barbara bought everything she needed and was soon preparing dinner for her husband and broth for her mother at the same time. While the food was boiling and baking, she called Matthew and explained the situation. "Matthew, Mom is in the hospital. I'm going to go see her. I'm not sure how long she'll be there. Dinner will be on the stove." My husband replied, "I'm aware of that. Jack told me you needed support. You wait for me, I'll try to get there early, and we'll go to the hospital together. See if there's anything else you need, and I'll be there for you." Matthew didn't let his wife down and took her and the 2 bags she had packed and drove her to the hospital. Barbara managed to persuade the nurse taking the bags to let her see her mother and the doctor, who was fortunately there. Matthew remained waiting for his wife in the lobby, but gave her kind words and wishes for a speedy recovery. Audrey tried to smile when she saw Barbara enter the room, but it was noticeable that she was uncomfortable and frightened. Barbara said a soft but distinctive hello to everyone in the room and made her way to her mother's bedside. A weight was suspended from the unfortunate woman's right leg. Her lips, swollen almost to the point of bleeding, were a clear indication that the victim of the ice had been in great pain. Barbara listened to her mother's account of her accident and, trying not to cry, began to put everything she had brought into the nightstand. The phone was immediately put on charge. She gave her mother tea with jam, broth, made her eat a few spoonfuls of raw, grated carrots. The internet says that such a salad in the first days after injury the best vitamin remedy. Then I'll give you some sauerkraut. It's good for you, too, Barbara said. Oh, don't worry, my daughter. You should probably go home, Matthew. He's probably worried you're gone, Audrey said. Barbara explained that her husband had rushed home when he heard what had happened so she wouldn't have to take a cab, but he hadn't been missed. But he said hello, as if he'd just been waiting for that line. The woman lying in the next bed became active. Sanitarians, nurses here are rude, boorish women. And you interfere in the conversation. It is impossible to call them neither day nor night. They serve teas, make fun of doctors, give chocolates. Even giving them money is useless. They're not even doing their job properly anyway. Barbara kept silent, and having found out from her mother the name and patronymic of her attending doctor, went in search of him. The restless neighbor also made a good point. In the residence room, if not, then in the dressing room, looked there, probably with someone cooing keen. Thanking the nagging woman dryly, Barbara went out into the corridor. The nurses in the trauma room, accustomed to all sorts of relatives, tears and hysterics, looked at the visitor, asking how to find a doctor with a mixture of irritation and fatigue. But one of them, who held herself like a superior, answered thoroughly. Patrick is now in the superintendent's office, the penultimate door at that end of the corridor. Wait there. Or you can sit on the bench near the residence room. Barbara waited for the doctor, and he recognized her as Audrey's daughter. He invited her into the office, showing her the picture on the computer screen. "If I may say so, your mother's fracture was a success," Patrick explained. "In general, there are 2 treatment options." The man began to explain the nuances of each option, then asked, "Which one did you decide on?" Barbara looked the doctor in the eyes, but did not answer, but asked a counter question. "Say, Patrick, for example, if a patient with the same fracture as my mom had a loved one, what would you recommend?" Smiling, the doctor replied briefly, "A similar case was with my aunt. Our superintendent performed a similar operation on her a year ago, and as she now leads an active life, even works at the cottage, so I cannot keep up with her." The woman clarified all the details of the upcoming surgery, wrote down what else should be brought for the postoperative period, and having said goodbye to the doctor, left the office. Barbara had to announce to her mother that the surgery was scheduled for the next day, and she presented the news as lightly as possible, trying not to disturb her mother. Tomorrow I'll go and meet you. You'll be fine after the operation, don't worry. Barbara, what about your job? The boss is probably going to be mad, Audrey asked. Don't worry about that. I'll do all the work and I won't let you or the chief down. With the surgery, the long road to getting Audrey walking again had just begun. For 2 weeks, Barbara visited her mother almost daily to feed and nurse her. The woman tried to object and repeatedly stated, "Barbara, you take care of yourself. Don't come to see me so often. The food here is not bad, and I have no appetite. Where would it come from if my energy is not used for anything?" But Audrey couldn't change her daughter's mind. When the day of discharge arrived, Barbara went to the doctor's office for recommendations. Patrick was cautious and warned. "Your mom is a very energetic lady, but I've made my point, and I'll make it to you again. I wouldn't be overly optimistic if I were you. But there's no need to despair, although you can't use your injured limb for full weight bearing. Crutches are your mom's best friend for the next month. And then you have to be careful too. Of course, it is necessary to move, but carefully. Prophylactic treatments are indicated to prevent bed sores. In 6 weeks, I'll be waiting for a follow-up X-ray. We'll see what stage of fusion the bone will be in. That's pretty much it." Barbara asked. "Maybe some vitamins for Mom to take?" Patrick shrugged. "Well, in principle you could, but in general you should be told about the rehabilitation plan at the polyclinic where you live." Barbara called a special cab specializing in the transportation of people with limited mobility. And after a heroic trek through the streets, Audrey was finally in her apartment. Barbara faced a new problem. Audrey's physical condition still left much to be desired. Even a simple trip to the restroom or kitchen could result in a new injury. At first, Barbara came to Audrey's house twice a day, and closer to the New Year's holidays, she was practically exhausted. The traffic jams were so time-consuming that there were only a few hours left for sleep. Barbara turned to her husband. "Matthew, let's let Mom stay with us for a while. At least I won't have to go back and forth between apartments." The man answered grimly, and after a quick pause, "Barbara, I feel wonderful about your mother. Audrey is a wonderful woman, but I'm sorry. But I'm going to be blunt, we have nowhere to put her here. I mean, it's a studio apartment. It's a big room, but there's only one room. When I talked you into taking out a mortgage, I didn't get any sympathy. Both you and your mom were against it. Matthew, there's got to be some kind of a screen. It'd be like having 2 rooms. Look, but Audrey would be the first thing that would be uncomfortable. I play computer games loudly. I listen to music all night. Besides, you should ask her if she'd be willing to move. I'm 100% sure she'll say no. Your mom is very tactful and wise and realizes that the further away she lives, the better her relationship with her son-in-law will be." Matthew turns out to be right. Audrey, having barely heard the idea of moving into her son-in-law and daughter's apartment, only exclaimed indignantly, "There can't even be a conversation. At home and the walls help. I will not go to your place, especially there, and it will be inconvenient to be sick in peace." Barbara obeyed her mother's will. She didn't want to argue with her husband. She continued to waste time standing in traffic and left the place of a lawyer in Jack's firm. With the permission of her boss, Barbara transferred to a half-time position and was very glad that the manager was able to meet her needs. She prepared the contracts during the visit and trained her smart girl, and diligently performed all the duties that did not require constant presence in the office. The rehab, however, took a lot more money than the woman had realized. Sometimes she shared with her husband her indignation at the fact that pharmacies changed prices at will and tried to sell the most expensive version of a drug. And then Matthew would grumble. "Look, Barbara, your mother must have some free medication." The woman tried not to answer. After all, the family budget did not suffer, and money from her husband for almost 6 months since the fateful news of her mother's troubles. She did not ask. Barbara had generally tried to handle the situation on her own, without Matthew's interference. The weather was changing. Barbara's schedule remained almost unchanged by the tradition that had formed. In the morning, she would make her husband breakfast and, if she had time, make preparations for lunch and dinner. Then, after putting some of the breakfast in containers, she would rush to her mother's house, stopping at stores and pharmacies along the way. Taking care of her, keeping her spirits up, and helping her move around the apartment took a lot of time. Barbara would then run to the office and rush home by evening in case of any emergencies. Her neighbor, the same Gabriella who had helped her wait for the ambulance, had the key to her mother's apartment. She would sometimes drop by to watch TV and gossip together, so Audrey couldn't be called abandoned. But Barbara was desperate to get her mom back on her feet, and not just because she had to spend a lot of time traveling between very distant parts of the city every day, without weekends and holidays. It was just that Mom was the closest person to her. She had, in fact, given Barbara life twice. The first time was on her birthday 38 years ago, but more importantly later when a terrible tragedy struck Barbara in a terrible avalanche. It was her mother who was there for her in those black days, helped her to move around when her legs almost collapsed due to nervousness, forced her to drink and eat, then by persuasion, then by force. Abandoning her monetary and not dusty work, my mother sold the apartment in their hometown and, almost as a huge and clumsy cule, moved it 2,000 kilometers away from the place where everything Barbara reminded her of her inhuman grief. It was Audrey who had forced her to take a job where it was almost impossible to be alone with her sad thoughts, where she had to look stylish and trim. Barbara did not consider her help to her mother as self-sacrifice and, despite her fatigue, tried to surround her husband with care. Moreover, the 10-year wedding anniversary was approaching, and the woman wanted to organize a touching congratulation and a pleasant surprise for patient Matthew. She made a preliminary version of the menu in advance. She found a confectionery where orders were made on individual designs and agreed to prepare an unusual figurative cake for her husband. "I love his sweets," Barbara said. The holiday was approaching, but shortly before it arrived, Matthew, during his morning breakfast, warned, "Sorry, Barbara, but I need a car for a few days. I have to go to the branch office in the neighboring region, because something seems to be going on there with the branch manager's reports. Profits are down by leaps and bounds. Although in other divisions everything is even. And in some places even growth is observed. Of course I'll try to make a quick trip, but airplanes are unlikely to fly in those parts. And I don't feel like taking the train. Can you manage without a car?" Although Barbara herself was counting on the faithful family horse, she didn't argue. After all, her husband really needed the car more. She smiled. "I'll manage, of course." Matthew thanked her politely for breakfast and promised, "Nothing will buy you an iron horse a little later. The situation at work will normalize, and you'll choose a model." Running out of the house, the man kissed his wife on the cheek, winked and said, "Don't worry, I remember our wedding anniversary. I'll try to be there Friday night." Taking advantage of her husband's absence, Barbara moved to her mother's house for a while, so as not to waste time on the road. During these few days, she had time to do a general cleaning, and the apartment was somehow especially fresh in spring. Only on the eve of the holiday, Barbara had to return home. To bring to the office, she urgently needed a diploma. However, it was even better, because she had to clean up the house and prepare some of Matthew's favorite salads. In the morning, the woman took the holiday treats that had been put aside in separate containers and rushed to her mother's house. She habitually gave her a massage, helped her walk around her room, and even after waiting for the elevator repairs to be completed, finally took her mother outside so she could rejoice in the nice weather and enjoy the feeling of life returning to the way it was before the injury. After a short walk, Audrey and Barbara had lunch, and the daughter began to apologize. "Mommy, you'll have to excuse me, please. I'm going to leave early today. I want to surprise Matthew. Turn off the TV when you get bored. Your cell phone's charged. Call me if you need anything, okay?" "Run, Barbara." Happy holidays and cheers. Wow, 10 years together. She kissed her mom and Barbara ran along the route she'd planned. Spring, which had long ago entered its rites and was rapidly approaching summer, gave soft warmth, and the sweet and tart aroma of blossoming lilac set the mood for the most romantic mood. Contrary to popular belief that marriage in May portended trouble, she did not have to suffer in her second marriage. On the contrary, Matthew was for a woman a safe haven. There were no violent passions between them, but there was mutual sympathy and respect. Barbara appreciated her husband for the fact that he did not pry into her soul, did not pester her with jealousy and suspicion, did not demand to give birth to an heir or heiress. It was only when he announced his serious intentions that Barbara warned him directly and honestly that children were not part of her plans. The man was not frightened by this statement. A few years after the wedding, Matthew asked if she had changed her mind about the child. But having heard a categorical no, did not begin to find out the reasons and did not raise this topic again. The man was a good partner, and of course she loved him in her own way, with all the strength her wounded heart was capable of. Following the list she'd made the day before, Barbara bought drinks, picked up the calamari Matthew adored. And so she bought little things: a crusty baguette, fresh green salad, fruit. The 2 large shopping bags that Barbara had thoughtfully brought with her were gradually filling up. Having hung them on both shoulders, she ran into the pastry shop where she had ordered a cake. Now it was time to go home. As she approached the driveway, Barbara looked hopefully at the family parking space and breathed a sigh of relief there was no car. So she would have time to set the table, hang the balloons, and dress up before her husband returned. Praising herself mentally for the handy bags, thanks to which one hand was free, the woman hurriedly opened the door and finally found herself in the family nest. Placing the box with the cake on the banquet, Barbara suddenly froze with surprise. The familiar hum of a residential apartment building was brazenly interfered with by a foreign sound coming from the kitchen. Strangely, there were no foreign shoes on the mat. There were no foreign things visible, but the clatter of dishes came to her quite clearly, as if someone had moved a massive plate or a bulky mug. Matthew and Barbara kept no pets. All they wanted was a cute dog. An unfortunate accident with their mom had tweaked that plan. It probably would have been much smarter to go out to the playground, close the door, and call her husband. But from fatigue, Barbara didn't act as safety dictated. Automatically pulling her sneakers off her feet, and with her bag squarely on her shoulders, the woman walked into the kitchen and nearly collapsed with surprise, tucking one leg under her. On a chair sat a boy of about 6 years of age. The unknown little guest was completely engrossed in his meal. On the table in front of him was Matthew's huge mug, a bottle of water, and a large deep plate into which Barbara had assembled the puffed salad from the evening before, so that it would have time to soak. A spoon sticking out from the edge clearly indicated that the dish had already been unceremoniously sampled. The child bit into the stick of cheese and smoked sausage with gusto, and the woman's heart clenched as the memories came flooding back. It was too painful to act rationally. For a few seconds, Barbara even thought she was hallucinating because of overwork or some other reason. However, the sight, the sound, the image, and even the aroma of the sausage were too realistic. The engrossed boy broke away from his tasty pastime only after Barbara, in a voice a little hoarse from nervous shock, caught his attention with a question. "Hello, who are you? And what are you doing here?" The boy jumped up from his chair and, without letting go of the sausage, reported. "My name is Roger. Uncle Matthew brought me here, told him to wait here, said I could eat whatever I wanted. So I'm eating. It's good sausage, but it's very salty." Barbara had no idea that the man the boy called Uncle Matthew wasn't her husband. There was no such incredible coincidence as in a traditional New Year's Eve movie. when the hero didn't realize he'd opened someone else's apartment with his own keys and was completely unconcerned by the typical furnishings of a standard apartment. Barbara could safely vouch for the fact that it wasn't easy to find even a closely similar design as in her and her husband's place. Surely there must be a logical explanation for the boy's appearance in the kitchen, the woman thought. She herself, having married Matthew, had become Davies, and Roger's last name meant absolutely nothing to her. Her husband was the only child of his parents, but he had cousins, as far as Barbara knew. Except they hadn't been invited to the modest wedding, and she didn't know them by face or surname. So it was quite possible that the Roger sitting before her was the child of one of her husband's cousins. But why had he, without even warning, suddenly brought this boy to their apartment? Shaken out of her psychological equilibrium, Barbara couldn't concentrate. Her thoughts were jumbled, and she hadn't even had time to think of any plausible version when Matthew called. Coming out of her daze, Barbara finally took the bags off her shoulders and took the call. The man began to speak quickly, literally not letting his wife get a word in edgewise. "Love, you and I just missed each other by a little bit. I've just left Audrey's apartment, and I'll be there in 20 minutes to explain everything to you. Set the table." Okay, the confused woman cheered up a little and replied briefly. She felt Roger's gaze on her very clearly, but she could not find the strength to look him in the eye. The woman brought from the hallway her new slippers, just recently purchased in anticipation of the approaching summer season, and suggested, "Roger, you have sneakers. It's hot at home. Keep your flip-flops. Put them on. It will be more comfortable and convenient." The child silently obeyed. To defuse the situation and occupy the boy thrown to her, but at the same time to avoid having to talk to him a lot, Barbara asked, "Roger, do you know how to inflate balloons?" The boy nodded. The woman quickly went to the room and brought the child a whole package of balloons. Then, obeying some impulse, she licked the tips through which Roger was to inflate the balloons and handed them to him, asking, "Don't inflate too much. When you get tired, rest, and I'll help you tie them. Deal?" The child nodded dutifully and, without feeling any embarrassment, asked, "And what's your name?" "Barbara." There was silence in the kitchen. The boy, thinking about something, was busy with the marbles. Barbara kept an eye on her guest and began to sort through the bags, prepare what was planned, and gradually set the table. She put the cake in the refrigerator and, distracted by tying the inflated balloons, felt a pinch of pain rather than irritation. She wasn't angry with her husband, but her mind was spinning incessantly with all sorts of thoughts. The woman felt the curious gaze of the little guest, but did not dare to look him in the eye. So they looked at each other, but hardly spoke to each other. Barbara did not notice how Matthew came into the kitchen with a huge bouquet of roses in his hands and a large bag. The man put the bag on the floor and handed the flowers to his wife. "Barbara, congratulations to you and myself on our holiday. I see that you and Roger have already made friends. That's wonderful. Well then, let's celebrate." The boy was visibly cheerful, and after Matthew appeared, he said modestly, "Congratulations." And when everyone sat down at the table after the inevitable fuss, he boasted loudly, "Uncle Matthew, I inflated the balloons myself and Barbara helped me tie them. That's a nice surprise we got for you." The grown man mumbled something inaudible in response, praising Roger and his wife, who hadn't even touched the food. There was tension in the apartment, and Matthew set about remedying the situation. He softly turned on the music and began to enthusiastically praise the dishes his wife had prepared. Then he made a toast to Barbara's beauty and charm. He took a box out of his pocket, handed it to her, and said, "Congratulations. I hope you like it." The woman, confused in her assumptions and thoughts about why her husband had brought a child to the apartment, only now remembered her gift. Leaving the not-too-cheerful company for a while, Barbara, clutching the unopened box in the palm of her hand, took out the hidden present. Returning to the table, she handed the package to her husband and confined herself to a parsimonious phrase. In honor of your wedding anniversary. Matthew hastily tore the wrapping paper, marveled at the pewter mug, and began to show the gift to Roger. The woman felt uncomfortable and sank back into her thoughts, not at all how she had envisioned the wedding anniversary celebration. She had wanted to prepare a surprise, but her husband had managed not only to surprise her, but to throw her completely off balance in the most natural way. Barbara coughed violently from surprise, choking on her mineral water, when she heard the question addressed to her. "Barbara, Roger's going to stay with us for a couple of weeks, okay?" Matthew said. Barbara was silent, not knowing what to say. Matthew tried to justify himself. "I stopped by Audrey's to pick you up on my way home. I wanted to explain everything to you, but I didn't have time. It was a surprise. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, but I was sure that I would pick you up at your mom's and tell you on the way that we had a guest." Matthew's monologue ended in a long silence. Barbara moved the food on her plate with her fork without looking up at her husband. He, confused, didn't know what else to say for himself. With childlike directness, Roger broke into the silence by asking, "Aunt Barbara, thank you. I've already eaten. Can I have some cake now?" The boy showed the empty plate, and with a stony face, Barbara got up from the chair and went to the refrigerator. She wanted to scream, stomp her feet, and sob. Her faith in her husband's honesty was shaken. But she knew it wouldn't make it any easier. The most likely explanation for Matthew's bringing Roger to the apartment seemed to be that he had been unfaithful. With all her being, Barbara now hated the man she had loved for 10 years as much as she knew how. Matthew, who knew his wife well, guessed from her impulsive movements that she would say what was on her mind. So he decided to take the little guest away from the table to a sitting area where he could distract himself from the upcoming serious adult conversation. "Roger, come on, I'll turn on the game console. True, my games are mostly complex, but we can find something to your taste on the internet. Or cartoons if you want." "Are you allowed to eat cake there?" asked the boy. "Of course you can eat anything," Matthew said. The boy's eyes sparkled, and he trustingly followed the owner of the apartment to the cozy, soft corner. Barbara, having heard the conversation between her husband and the guest, cut a large piece of cake, carefully placed it on a plate, turned on the electric kettle, and carefully watched it boil. The click of the kettle turning off brought Barbara out of her reverie. She was making tea. The woman placed a cup of the delicious beverage, sugar and spoon, and a plate of cake on a tray, then carried it to a table near the play area of the apartment. Matthew was showing Roger a collection of computer games, but the boy, who was clearly well-mannered, broke away from the fascinating activity and thanked. "Thank you very much." Barbara nodded and turned and walked away. When Matthew came into the kitchen, he found Barbara sitting on the floor, holding a pair of children's sneakers. Tears were rolling down her cheeks. The man tried to make a joke. "Barbara, what's wrong with you?" A child with dirty shoes walked into the kitchen. "Now, robot vacuum cleaner, turn on, let him work. It's no big deal. It's nothing. Why get upset over a little dust? Especially since it's a holiday." Barbara looked at her husband in a way that made him uncomfortable and said quietly, "Matthew, I think I've told you repeatedly that I don't want to be in the same space with the children for too long. It's beyond me. There must have been good reasons for what you did, or, as you put it, for the surprise. And you're understandable. But I'm sorry, I don't have the slightest desire to deal with any of this today. I'm going to go to my mother's and stay with her for a while." Matthew could not understand the reason for such a categorical decision of his wife, but he saw that Barbara was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, so he suggested, "Barbara, I'm really very guilty for not warning you, but I can explain everything. I think that when you hear me out, you'll realize that I couldn't have done anything differently. I'll wait until you're ready to talk." Suddenly, the woman gently put down the children's sneakers, wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, and went to the door, as if she hadn't heard her husband. Matthew took his wife's hand and asked, "Barbara, wait a minute. I'll call a cab to Audrey's house so I don't have to worry about you." Barbara nodded and was soon in the cab car. She was holding her purse in her hands. The road was clear, and it took much less time to get to her mom's house than it did during peak hours. As soon as the woman opened the door, she heard, "Gabriella, come in, dear. I'm not feeling very well." Barbara closed the door behind her and went straight into her mother's bedroom. Audrey was alarmed to see her daughter. "Barbara, what are you doing back? Didn't Matthew come home? By my reckoning, your wedding anniversary celebration should be in full swing. And you're here for some reason. Daughter, what's wrong?" Barbara walked over to her mother's bed, sat down on the floor, and leaned her head against Audrey's palm and told her everything that had happened since she had come home and seen Roger there. When she had finished her story, Barbara made her suggestion. "Mom, I'm pretty sure Roger is Matthew's illegitimate son. The boy looks to be about 6 years old. So my husband cheated on me and had the nerve to show me evidence of his infidelity on our wedding anniversary." Audrey tried to reassure her daughter. "I'm sure Matthew can explain everything. I can feel that he loves you. Believe my experience, he would hardly risk his relationship with you and cheat." Barbara, however, cried without stopping. Audrey stroked her so mature but defenseless daughter, but no more words were spoken because they were all powerless. Finally, when the flow of tears dried up, Barbara silently got up from the floor and went to wash her face swollen with tears. The woman felt completely devastated. Returning to her mother's room, Barbara confessed, "I'm very tired for today, and I don't mind lying down." Audrey did not object and suggested, for example, to talk some more and have dinner. She realized that her unhappy daughter needed to rest. "Of course, Barbara, but let's get you and me something to calm you down." "Of course, Barbara. Valerian, at least. It would do you and me good." Barbara complied with her mother's request and went to bed. The nervous tension was so intense that the woman passed out and woke up when the clock read 10. She jumped up on the couch and rushed to the kitchen, where she caught Audrey's mother preparing the batter for pancakes. "Good morning, daughter. You're just in time. Are we having breakfast now?" The women made pancakes in 4 hands and, as if they were in agreement, never said a word about yesterday's situation. As Barbara was washing the dishes, Audrey asked, "Daughter, please go to the theater with Gabriella. She has 2 tickets to a very good play, great seats in the parlor. Her niece gave them to her for her birthday. They were supposed to go together. And then, as luck would have it, her niece got sick. The rest of the family can't keep Gabriella company. Some of them are called away on country plots, some are on a business trip. So the ticket's gone. It's a shame." Barbara shook her head. "Mommy, I don't want to go anywhere. I'm not in the mood." However, if Audrey had something on her mind, she knew how to insist on her own. "That's why you should go, because you're not in the mood. Art is great at switching thoughts in your head and changing emotions. Please, daughter, not for the sake of the missing ticket, but for me. I want to." Barbara had to comply with her mother's wish. However, she refused the offer to run to the hairdresser beforehand and get a new haircut. After waiting for Gabriella to take Barbara away, Audrey called her son-in-law and said in an almost commanding tone, "Matthew, Barbara won't be here until about 3 p.m. Come over, we need to talk." The man did not resist, but warned, "Audrey, I'll be there, but I don't have anyone to leave Roger with. I don't think I can find a nanny." but I wouldn't trust the boy to someone I don't know, so I can only come with him. Do you mind?" The woman sighed. "I don't mind." "Me? Great. Then Roger and I will be at your place in half an hour." 30 minutes later, Audrey, carefully reaching the door, leaning on a walker, let Matthew and Roger into the apartment. The man introduced the child, and the boy Roger said a polite hello. Mistress Audrey tried not to betray her incredible excitement and hospitably invited Roger into the kitchen. "Come in. I have a TV and cakes waiting for you. Do you want cocoa or tea?" The child announced that he tastes most delicious coffee, but it is not allowed for children to drink this drink often, and he will drink tea because he is too old for cocoa. Audrey almost laughed out of surprise, but she got her emotions under control in time and, turning to Matthew, asked, "Can we give Roger some tea too?" And she was more like a treat. "It's almost like coffee." The boy rejoiced. "I want to try this drink. Matthew, may I?" And Matthew said yes. As the hostess deftly prepared the treat for Roger, the man handed the boy his smartphone and explained, "I need to talk to Audrey. You, please stay here. Eat the treats, play on your phone, maybe even watch some videos on the internet for a bit." Good, sure, where there are words. I'm perfectly capable of being unsupervised, don't worry. Observing this picture, Audrey could barely restrain herself from crying. Hiding her emotions, she slowly walked toward the room, which was old-fashionedly called the hall. Matthew followed her, eager to find out what Audrey wanted to talk to him about. The woman sat down in an armchair, and the man sat on a sofa across from it, so that the conversation could be carried on comfortably. The hostess looked at her son-in-law attentively, but he did not endure long and asked without preamble, "Audrey, will you explain to me why Barbara reacted so inadequately to Roger's appearance in our apartment? Will I admit my guilt? If anything, I did not warn her. But we're adults." Instead of having a calm conversation, she basically just ran to you. "Is that normal?" The woman did not interrupt the indignant speech of her son-in-law, but his question was not in a hurry to answer, and asked a counter-question. "Before I start a difficult conversation to try to help my daughter to keep the family, I need to be sure that it makes sense. Tell me the truth, Matthew. Is Roger your illegitimate son?" The man's outrage was unparalleled. "No, of course not. I've never thought of cheating on Barbara. I love her very much, I respect her, but her attitude towards children is starting to scare me. Roger was in our apartment because of a desperate situation, but Barbara didn't even try to get along with him. Although, as you may have noticed, he is a well-mannered, bright, and charming boy." Matthew's answer calmed the worried Audrey, and taking a deep breath, as if preparing to make a parachute jump, she decided to tell her son-in-law the truth. "What is it?" "All things secret, as they say, come to light. As a husband, you have the right to know why my daughter avoids contact with children. I think I have the right to tell you her story, which at first seemed like a happy fairy tale, and then turned into a terrible nightmare that destroyed the usual life. Barbara grew up a wonderful and clever girl, and was a real joy for me and my husband. We had no problem to arrange her to study in one of the best gymnasiums in our city. The income of our family and the positions held by me and my husband allowed Barbara to be her own among the same, as they say, golden youth. However, the gymnasium had a very strong teaching staff, and grades were not for sale, as you might think. Children were skillfully interested in learning, and our Barbara was one of the best students in the class. She was even made a tutor for her desk mate Frank. The boy was from a very good family, quite influential in our town. His dad was a district attorney, and his mom was in the same department in the last position. In general, they lived better than our family, but they didn't hinder the development of their son's friendship with Barbara. They welcomed her wholeheartedly. They did not talk to me and my husband through the lip, but quite kindly. When Barbara was in 10th grade, her father died suddenly. A blood clot had broken, according to the autopsy. It was Frank's family that supported Barbara and me after this loss. I still thank them for that, because I was in such a state that I almost went to my husband. So of course I didn't mind at all when Barbara decided to marry Frank. So what if they were just over 18 at the time? Obviously, you can't stand in the way of real feelings. Frank's parents didn't mind either and were even happy to have my daughter as part of their family. A year after the wedding, Barbara and Frank had twins, 2 boys, Adam and Henry. Healthy, cheerful, and strong, they grew up and made us all happy. Barbara couldn't get enough of her babies. You know, Matthew, she used to tell me that she was walking, rolling the stroller in front of her, and her heart was ready to jump out of her chest every now and then. Of course, I helped whenever I could. My mother-in-law repeatedly suggested that Barbara hire a reliable nanny, but my daughter refused every time and mostly managed on her own. God knows what it cost her, but she did not give up her university studies, and even without a sabbatical leave managed to do without. And her father-in-law put her in a prestigious and well-paid job in such a position that the working day was strictly rationed. There was a social package and other benefits. He had the opportunity, of course. And he was not ashamed to patronize his daughter-in-law. Barbara was smart. When the boys were 6, my daughter became pregnant again. Frank welcomed the news with joy, and why should he? It was a wonderful family relationship. As far as I know, there's never been a fight between them. It was like the 2 halves were lucky enough to be united as a whole. I know a lot of people were jealous, and some of the ladies tried to have an affair with Frank. But he didn't want anyone but my daughter. Everything was so perfect. I never thought it would all come crashing down overnight because of a terrible tragedy. Barbara, of course, had to see a doctor. And Frank volunteered to pick up his sons from daycare. By a ridiculous coincidence, his car broke down that day, and he decided not to call a cab, but to take the children home through the park. The weather was beautiful, and although the rides were not yet open, there was a pizzeria at the exit of the park that the boys were eager to go to. Frank met a buddy on the way, and while he was talking to him, the kids scattered. They ran out onto the lake, but the marsh ice was treacherously thin. My grandchildren, as witnesses later told me, didn't even have time to scream. They went under in a flash. Frank and his buddy rushed to the pond. But no luck. Only the divers who arrived at the scene of the tragedy managed to catch the boys. Frank later tried to justify himself, like a clockwork, constantly repeating that he was distracted only for a few seconds. What's the use? Our boys had drowned. There was no fixing it. My son-in-law was the first to tell me this bitter news because he was afraid for Barbara, and for good reason. I went to the private clinic where I knew Barbara was at the time. My heart told me that it was better to have doctors close by when the worst of grief came upon my daughter. Seeing me in the hallway, Barbara must have realized everything by the look on my face. She was hysterical after hearing the news. Barbara could not be calmed down, even with a large dose of medication. She never went home that night. She ended up in the hospital with a nervous breakdown. My daughter was worried about her dead sons and was unable to save the baby that was developing under her heart. The doctors didn't even consider him a baby yet, and she had already lost him. At Adam and Henry's funeral, Barbara stood like a stone statue. No tears, no emotion. Pale as death. Especially frightening was the emptiness in her eyes. Frank was no less worried. In his 25 years, he tried to take Barbara's hand for support, but she shied away from him like a leper. She never again crossed the threshold of the apartment where she lived with her husband and sons. How many times Frank had tried to talk to her, I couldn't count. Only it never worked. Barbara just cut her husband out of her life. Frank's mom came to us when she realized my daughter didn't want to see or hear from her husband. She was on her knees, begging me to forgive her son, saying he wasn't himself. I shared my sad thoughts that he was on the verge of leaving this world. But Barbara didn't react. She could never forgive her husband for the death of her sons. Frank could not forgive himself either. Indeed, he had turned from a blossoming man into a pale semblance of his former self. Barbara predictably quit her job, seemingly of her own accord. But in fact, everyone realized that she simply could not be under everyone's scrutiny. To make matters worse, an unusual and unexpected problem had arisen. The daughter was approaching hysterics. It was worth it to go outside and see the child. She would change her route, but it was impossible to absolutely eliminate the possibility of meeting children. One day, Barbara and I were riding in the elevator, and a neighbor with a baby came in with us. Everything seemed fine, but I wasn't too happy. After the neighbor got off the elevator, I looked at my daughter and saw that her chin was bleeding. So hard she bit her lip trying to hold back a tantrum. After this incident, my daughter stayed at home all day and night for almost a month. Even a special doctor, the best of the best, I called home. There were changes, but not quick and not at all positive. After a period of apathy, my daughter became aggressive. It was as if she had developed an obsession, and the medications prescribed by the doctor couldn't handle it for long. Barbara would take the pills for a few hours, become apathetic. Then she'd start thinking about something, pacing the room from side to side. Once I saw that she was looking for poison options on the net, and I was seriously frightened. I realized that my daughter had decided to deal with the unwitting perpetrator of her children's deaths. I tried to be there all the time, to keep an eye on my daughter, so she wouldn't do anything irreparable. One morning, Barbara managed to leave the house while I was asleep. People told me later that she caught up with Frank after his work and attacked him with her fists. She was yelling, "Why are you living here? Why don't our sons?" I don't know, maybe my acquaintances exaggerated. But supposedly 4 strong men could barely pull her away from a distraught Frank. He didn't even fight back. When I came to pick her up, my daughter was sitting in the back room, where the aroma of the hated Corvalol and some other drugs was wafting. She was almost unresponsive to anything. I was told that an ambulance had come and sedated Barbara. Among acquaintances and neighbors, of course, there was only talk about the accident with my grandchildren, and that Barbara was going crazy with grief. One day, Frank's father called me and urged me to leave town with his daughter. You don't say no to people like him. Besides, I was thinking of ways to hide my daughter from memories, sympathetic and prying eyes. I quit my job, sold my apartment, again thanks to my son-in-law's parents. I managed to do it quickly, and at a price that was quite adequate, given the urgency. Barbara and Frank were divorced in absentia, again thanks to his relatives. My daughter didn't even have to go anywhere. We ended up moving to this town, away from everything. And then you know the rest, Matthew. You met her and my daughter started to come back to life. Don't think Barbara still hates it. She's just still in pain. She even refuses the opportunity to be a mom again for fear of repeating the nightmare she went through. Audrey was silent. Telling her daughter's terrible story, the woman was mentally exhausted. Matthew noticed how pale her face had become and hurried to the kitchen to fetch her some water. Roger was playing on his phone, and the man stroked his head, refilled his glass, and returned to Audrey in the hall. "Sorry, what made you remember everything?" he asked. The woman drank the water carefully and spoke bitterly. "Ah, Matthew, if only it could be forgotten. I probably should have told you about Barbara's past sooner. I've been hesitant to tell you. My daughter still can't talk about it either, I understand." The man looked at the woman, puzzled, and confessed. "To be honest, I had no idea that Barbara's reluctance to become a mom could hide such a tragedy. I thought she probably didn't want to ruin her figure. I can't even imagine how she felt when she saw Roger in our kitchen. What a surprise to surprise her on our anniversary. How am I supposed to apologize to Barbara and make her understand?" I really didn't have anywhere to bring Roger, the man continued. And the boy, for a number of reasons. I had to be sheltered for a week or two in a comfortable and safe place where his parents' enemies would have no reason to look. It all came about almost by accident. I arrived at the branch and ran into an old friend on the street whom I hadn't seen since my discharge. Hugh is more than a friend. He's the only reason I survived the army. But it's a long story. In the civilian life, we were separated by our hometowns, and as it happens, our contacts were lost. I tried to find him on social networks, but no luck. I guess I should have been more persistent. Then I would have found him, and then I got busy building my career. Anyway, I hadn't seen him in 15 years, and now I meet Hugh in a city that's foreign to both of us. I know he's changed over the years, but I recognized him immediately. He almost walked past me without noticing, but I stopped him. It turned out Hugh had come to solve his sister's and her husband's problems. They were embroiled in a lawsuit with some inadequate people who were used to dealing with things in a criminal way. Roger, of course, is just a perfect boy. He got to know his way around in a strange place. He even went to bed by himself, having brushed his teeth beforehand. Hugh was most worried about Roger, his nephew. He explained to his sister that the child should be hidden just in case, because through him the bandits could easily influence the decision of the issue in their favor. But they couldn't think of any safe place. And that's where I came in. To Hugh, the idea of taking Roger out of town seemed the ideal. Indeed, there were practically no clues that could put the bandits on the child's trail. It was a good thing that the boy had a strong character, a real man growing up. His parents and Hugh told him he had to stay with me for a while, and he took the news calmly. I picked him up like a detective, so as not to get caught on the city's CCTV cameras. We agreed to contact Hugh in a week, and he's supposed to call me when it's resolved. Roger and I are very easy to talk to, but I have to work on Monday, and I can hardly take him with me. I don't know what to do now, the man said. Matthew was silent. Suddenly, he and Audrey heard Barbara's voice. It's no big deal. You go to work as usual. I'll stay with Roger, only on the condition that the boy didn't have to take public transportation himself. It turned out that, contrary to Audrey's calculations, her daughter had already returned from the theater and seemed to have heard part of her husband's story. Preempting her mother's question, Barbara explained. I couldn't watch the play in the theater. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, and realized that I couldn't go back and stare at the stage without even trying to understand the story. I texted Gabriella to apologize and came here. Turns out I got back just in time. I guess I should have heard Roger's story from the outside because, Matthew, I'm sorry I suspected you of cheating. And I wouldn't have believed you if you'd told me all that yesterday. Today I can look at the situation more rationally. Mom, you don't mind if I visit with Roger, do you? Barbara asked. Audrey, trying not to frighten away the change in her daughter's attitude toward her children, spoke very carefully. Of course, come. Audrey wanted to say something else, but tears came to her eyes and she decided to change the subject. Barbara. Matthew, aren't you hungry? I could eat something right now. Let's go into the kitchen. All the more reason to see if Roger's having a good time. I've forgotten all about the rules of hospitality. When the boy saw Barbara, he remembered to say hello. The woman's voice trembled slightly as she responded to his greeting. Matthew, who had understood the reason for his wife's strange behavior, was now amazed at her resilience. She had been through such an ordeal and had never tried to appeal to his pity or to elicit sympathy by telling him what she had faced. Barbara gently but insistently dismissed Audrey's attempts to feed everyone gathered in her kitchen that evening. Thank you, Mom, for everything, but we should probably go home. I'll stop by tomorrow afternoon, she said. Matthew, realizing that he had received his wife's forgiveness, was very happy and bid Audrey a heartfelt farewell, promising, "We'll visit you all tomorrow. If you are feeling well and the weather is warm, we can go to the countryside, How would you like that, Audrey? That's a wonderful idea, Matthew. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, the woman said. After saying goodbye to the hostess, Barbara, Matthew, and Roger drove to the other side of town. The man sat behind the wheel, and in the mirror he could see his wife carefully fastening the boy's seatbelt. It was obvious that for Barbara it was a completely natural gesture, brought once to automaticity. She was obviously a reverent, caring mother. She loved her children very much, and after the tragedy that had befallen her, she was suffering in a way that her worst enemy could not wish. Matthew carefully parked the car in the driveway. The man carried Roger, who had drowned, to the apartment. Barbara laid him on the couch, spreading the crumpled sheet, carefully removed the boy's shoes and covered him with a blanket. Watching his wife, Matthew felt incredible tenderness for her. Suddenly, the woman he loved opened up to him from an unfamiliar side of her personality, and he realized that he had made the absolutely right choice. Later, with the door to the kitchen closed, they drank tea with the remaining cake, and as if there had been no wall of misunderstanding between them yesterday. With jokes and kisses, they planned the schedule for Sunday afternoon. The man dared to bring up the unpleasant subject and confessed. "Barbara, I'm a real idiot. I almost ruined everything by my actions, and I want to say thank you very much for understanding." His wife smiled. "Well, to be honest, I overreacted too, so I suggest we forget it. Forget it." The weekend passed cheerfully, and even better than the spouses expected. They managed to get Audrey out for a walk, who was much less happy about the sunny May day than she was about her daughter's happy eyes. Barbara was happy to answer Roger's questions and to keep an eye on him to make sure he wasn't in danger. Neither her mother nor her husband dared to reproach her for her hyper-opaque behavior. Roger did not seem to mind at all that he was surrounded by the utmost care. By agreement with Barbara, he called her by her first name without using the word aunt, and he seemed quite pleased with his unexpected journey. When they had brought Audrey home after the entertainment, the trio had to wait, for there was no chance of leaving the woman without being fed. No one minded, however. Late in the afternoon, as Barbara was putting Roger to bed, the boy asked her quietly, "Do you think my parents are doing well? Will I be able to see them soon?" Trying to keep her voice firm and convincing, Barbara replied, "Of course they are doing well. Very soon they will do all their business, and you will meet them." The reassured boy fell asleep. Barbara, fearful of waking the child, called her husband into the kitchen and began to question him about the story Roger's parents were involved in. "Barbara, I honestly don't even know all the details of that evening. My husband told me everything very briefly. But I realized that his sister and her husband were really attacked by some scumbags." The woman began to ask questions that surprised her husband. "These bandits are from the town you went to, or are they newcomers? Did they call each other anything? Did they have nicknames?" Matthew told everything he knew. But it was not enough for Barbara, and she suddenly asked, "Can't you get in touch with Hugh urgently? I need to get some clarifications from him to try to help Roger's parents. Of course, he's not bad and quite comfortable with us, I hope, but it shouldn't be that mother and son are separated for long." It was impossible to guess from Barbara's voice how closely she took Roger and his parents' situation to heart. But now, knowing about his wife's past, Matthew realized how difficult it was for her. In fact, Hugh gave me a password to a chat room that automatically deletes all messages. I think we can try to contact him. The man opened the necessary site, entered the data that he had learned by heart at the request of his army friend, and after a few minutes he exclaimed with joy, "It worked. See, he welcomed me." Barbara thoughtfully advised, "Matthew, ask him a question that you can tell if he's talking to you. And if there's even the slightest doubt, close the site immediately and pull the SIM card out of the phone." Alarmed by his wife's suspicions, Matthew quickly typed a few phrases and waited impatiently for a reply. After reading the message he received, the man exhaled a sigh of relief. "It's okay. It's definitely Hugh," he answered with our code phrase. Barbara nodded and asked, "Okay, text Hugh that your wife will be texting him now. And give me the phone number. I'll find out everything I need to know from your friend." No longer surprised by anything, Matthew handed the smartphone to his wife. She texted with someone she didn't know for quite a while. Then she grabbed a pen, quickly wrote down a number on a bread wrapper, tore off a piece of paper with numbers on it, clutched it in her hand, and handed the phone to her husband. Barbara left the kitchen and headed for the bathroom, which had the best noise insulation in the apartment. After taking a few deep breaths, the woman dialed her former father-in-law's memorized number. But the phone was unavailable. Barbara gathered all her will and dialed her ex-husband's number. Soon his voice sounded in the receiver. "Hello. Don't be silent." "Frank, it's me, Barbara." Her voice trembled with excitement. "Barbara, it's good to hear from you." The man's demanding tone softened considerably. "My father is abroad, but if you tell me what the problem is, I'll do my best to help you. I am now working in the regional prosecutor's office, so all my connections are at your service." "Thank you," the woman replied and told me everything she had learned, dictating the number she had written down. "Okay, Barbara, I get it. It's not the easiest thing in the world, but it's manageable. I think in the end, for every scumbag, there's a more powerful force. I'll try to help and warn this acquaintance that I'll call him tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, depending on how things turn out. He'll be able to take the call from his cell phone." "Thank you, Frank." Without waiting for her ex-husband's retort, Barbara ended the conversation and washed her face with ice water, hoping that it would bring her at least a semblance of composure. During her conversation with Frank, she wanted to apologize to him, but she couldn't. The bitter resentment of his neglect, which had caused her to lose her children, still burned her heart. At the same time, Barbara was well aware that without the intervention of her ex-husband, who had extensive connections in the area, Roger's family was practically doomed. And she wanted to keep the boy safe and try to save his parents. For a while, Barbara sat in the bathroom, equalizing her breathing with exercises. Seeing that an hour had practically passed, she returned to Matthew in the kitchen and informed him of what Frank had said. The man texted his friend the information he had received from his wife and hugged Barbara tightly. He saw how exhausted the woman he loved had become in the last hour and didn't know how to help her. He wanted to protect her from all adversity. Instead, Barbara had to turn, as Matthew easily guessed, to the man who had nearly destroyed her destiny to the ground. The conversation stirred the woman. She released herself from Matthew's embrace and automatically began clearing the table, not paying attention to the fact that she was sending her husband's completely untouched food into the trash. Finally, the man intercepted her hand and suggested, "Drop the fuss. It's been a hard day and we need to rest." Even as she listened to the peaceful breathing of her sleeping husband, Barbara could not calm down. The images of her little ones came to her mind's eye. They smiled toothless smiles at her. Then they were going to kindergarten for the first time and turning to the window, waving their little hands at her. They give her Mother's Day cards. Here, obviously conspiring, instead of falling asleep, they clap loudly and unanimously when she starts to sing them a lullaby. How many pleasant moments there were, so carefully stored somewhere far away in the memory. And so rudely all had been crossed out by an accident. How many times she had warned her sons not to take risks. And they still wouldn't listen. But what was the use of being angry now? You can't get the water back. Their father is now the only hope that Roger will soon be able to hug his mother. At least let Frank be able to help this complete stranger to Barbara. "Bab, bab, bab," Roger mumbled, and Barbara slipped out from under her husband's arm and hurried to the boy. Carefully, she adjusted the blanket, which he had almost thrown to the floor. Felt Roger's forehead, frightened that the child had spiked a fever, and breathing a sigh of relief, sensing that, from her experience, all was well. Roger opened his eyes and Barbara sat down on the edge of the couch and hummed softly a lullaby. The boy had long since fallen asleep, but the woman remained seated beside him. She wanted the child to return to his parents as soon as possible. And at the same time, she realized that she would desperately miss spending time with him. As the sky, visible through the slit between the curtains, lightened, Barbara went quietly to the kitchen to make herself some coffee and work on her papers, because there was no point in going to bed. In these lucid hours, maybe somewhere far away, were already deciding issues directly related to the fate of Roger. But Barbara was powerless to influence anything. She had already done all that she could, overcoming her resentment. And now all that remained was to wait for the result. After carefully studying the papers, the woman made notes in the margins, wrote out her suggestions on a separate sheet of paper, and carefully tucking everything away in a zippered folder, began, trying not to make any noise, to prepare breakfast. She had already decided to ask Audrey's boss to excuse her, so as not to tire the boy out too much by moving around unfamiliar places. After waiting for the time to send messages, Barbara typed to Audrey that she would send the prepared documents through her husband. She began to think about what she could do to please the little guest, who of course was worried about being separated from his parents, although he was trying to be a good boy. When Matthew, who had showered but was still yawning, came into the kitchen, Barbara had almost everything ready. She invited her husband to the table and asked, "Matthew, stop by on your way to Jack's and give him the file for me. I've already warned him that I won't be able to stop by work for a few days. And if there's anything that needs to be reviewed, have him email it to me or have it forwarded through you. As a last resort, of course, I'll come over. But I don't want to stress Roger out. I was going to take him to Audrey's mom's and then go to the Children's Entertainment Center. Why does he have to play on the computer all the time? Let him have fun, let him have fun, let him have fun, let him have fun. Keep his mind off the sad stuff. He was having nightmares at night." Matthew agreed to his wife's plan, and after quickly swallowing his breakfast, he thanked her and began to get ready for work. Roger woke up much later, but Barbara didn't think to wake him up. She wanted the boy to feel no discomfort. The woman fed the child and then suggested, "Let's stop by my mom's for a while and then we'll go somewhere to rest." Barbara received a text message on her phone, and she smiled when she saw the notification that the money had been deposited. Matthew made sure his wife didn't have any financial problems. The woman smiled and asked the boy, "Would you like me and you to go to an amusement park? It's not far from the city, and there are many different options for a fun vacation, a laughing room, rope courses, and I think even a climbing wall. Do you like that kind of active entertainment? Or maybe you prefer a movie? That's no problem either. I haven't seen a movie on the big screen in a long time." Roger confessed embarrassedly, "I'd rather go to an amusement park, to be honest. So that's where we'll head." Audrey was delighted when her daughter came to see her with the boy. It meant that Barbara believed her husband and didn't go out of her way to demand that the child be placed somewhere because of her traumas and memories. She could see that Barbara seemed desperate even after her brief interaction with Roger and barely got them to leave as soon as possible. "Daughter, I feel just fine today. Go have fun. I'll call you if there's anything, of course. In fact, don't worry about it. Really, I have more energy today after yesterday's walk." Audrey turned to the boy and asked Roger, "I beg you, rest well for you and for me." The boy nodded gravely and promised, "I'll have Barbara take pictures and send them to you. You have an advanced smartphone, don't you?" The woman smiled and praised. "Well done. That's a great idea. I'm sure I'll have fun with you." Barbara checked. "Do you have a charged cell phone?" Barbara reassured her mother, saying she could recharge her phone in the car at any time. Soon the guests left Audrey, and she, left alone, began to dream that her daughter would finally decide to be a mom again. It was obvious to the woman that Barbara could perfectly find a common language with children. She had suffered for so many years, purposely avoiding contact with them. Let everything turn out well for the injured girl, Audrey pleaded, hoping aloud that the plea would be heard somewhere upstairs. Barbara, driving with particular care, was taking Roger for fun and felt the weight of the responsibility she had voluntarily taken on. The boy had first of all asked to go on the rope course, and the woman had agreed. She wanted to grab the child in her arms and hold him in her arms. Barbara watched the boy and took photos from time to time, but she didn't dare to distract herself from sending especially expressive pictures to her mother. It seemed to the woman that if she took her eyes off the boy for even a few seconds, something bad would happen. The thought crossed her mind of the degree of desperation Roger's mom was in if she agreed to give her son to a near stranger. Such an act could only be dared because of the real threat to the child's life and health. So she, Barbara, had no right to let down a woman about whom she knew the bare minimum of information: name, surname, age, and the fact that the unfortunate woman, together with her husband, had gotten involved in a story from which she could not get out on her own. Barbara, however, was in an even more advantageous position. Erin, Roger's mother, knew even less about the people who had taken her son in. The fun-filled Monday had flashed by without a second thought. The boy, tired from his many outdoor activities, fell asleep after a hearty dinner and rested peacefully until morning without crying out or waking up. Matthew and Barbara chatted quietly in the kitchen. The woman spoke enthusiastically about how bravely Roger had conquered the rides and showed pictures. "Tomorrow I want to take our guest to our museums after his visit to his mother, and then go to the movies. Or vice versa, whichever Roger wants. If you can join us, it'll be fun. He's so funny, and sometimes he has such deep thoughts. He told me today that adults try to look serious on purpose so that they'll be afraid and no one will bother them. Can you believe that?" The man agreed that there was something reasonable in that conclusion. "And I suggest, Barbara, let's go to bed like Roger. Because tomorrow I expect it's going to be just as busy." Neither Tuesday nor Wednesday brought word from Frank or the boy's relatives. Although the child attended all sorts of entertaining and educational establishments, his mood grew worse every day. He became more and more reflective and sad. Matthew and Barbara realized that the boy was missing his family more and more, but they could not influence the situation. Only on Thursday, when Barbara and Roger were visiting Audrey, the long-awaited call came. Frank informed his ex-wife that the main difficulties were over and warned. "There are still a few things to be resolved, but that's minor. The main thing is that the boy is no longer in danger. His parents have already left in the direction of the city where you now live. I warned them to call you in advance, as they will arrive, and clarify the address. Anyway, I'll take this case to the final point, of course. Don't worry." Barbara thanked her ex-husband profusely. "Thank you, Frank, and forgive me for everything." The man's voice was ringing as he replied to the woman he had hurt so much. "Barbara, you don't know how glad I am to hear from you, even if it's for such an occasion. I wish you happiness, and if you need anything, don't hesitate to contact me. I'll always be glad to help you." Barbara said goodbye to her ex-husband. Audrey, hearing her daughter's conversation, couldn't believe her own ears. It seems that her Barbara quite adequately just communicated with a man whom she had once loved and then hated. "Mom, we have to leave. Roger's parents are already on the road, and I still need to give him a bath." The child realized that he would soon see his mom and dad and started jumping around the room, shouting yay. Barbara barely managed to keep him quiet. Audrey, happy that the situation had been resolved safely, gave the boy a souvenir of her photograph and a collection of stamps, which he liked so much. "Here you go, Roger. You'll look at the album and remember." "I won't forget me, Grandma Audrey," even without stamps, the child promised. Seizing the moment, Barbara called her husband to tell him the good news, but it turned out he already knew. "Barbara, Hugh told me that your help has solved everything. I'm taking a cab home now to get ready for the party." Barbara was a little sad to part with the boy who had awakened in her memories of the most joyous days with her sons, and she invited him to visit the toy store on the way. "You know, I'd really like to get you something too. Choose whatever you want." The boy did not resist, but apparently embarrassed, did not walk for a long time between the racks with toys on display. And very soon he took from the shelf not the most expensive robot. On the way to the checkout, Barbara put in the basket an airplane, which Roger had once told her admiringly, and some more board games. "Oh, so many things," marveled the child. "What a celebration today." "Yes, Roger, it's a very big party today," Barbara agreed. By the time the doorbell rang, the boy was already cleanly ransomed and the cutlery was flaunting on the table. Erin, barely over the threshold, rushed to her son, hugging him and showering him with kisses. The boy's father handed Barbara flowers, and Hugh gave Matthew a firm, manly hug. After Roger, assuming the role of an adult, introduced the parents to the owners of the apartment, everyone sat down to eat. Erin volunteered to help Barbara and confessed, "If it weren't for your kindness, I don't know how we would have gotten through this. I don't know how to express my gratitude. My husband and I have raised money to offset the cost of Roger and your inconvenience." Barbara turned pale and replied, "Erin, put that envelope away at once. Don't insult me with this act. You have a boy who will be going to school soon, so spend this money on him. If it's not too much trouble, send me and my husband a picture of him once in a while. That would be the best thanks." Outraged, Erin burst into tears and hugged Barbara. When Roger, disturbed by his mother and Barbara's long absence from the table, looked into the kitchen, he saw the women roaring, unable to hold back their tears, and began to ask in a mature manner, "What happened? Did you get bumped, cut, burned?" Barbara and Erin wiped away their tears synchronously. "It's okay, sweetie, and everything is just fine," the mom reassured her son. Putting her arms around the boy, she picked him up, lifted him up, and surrounded him. Barbara watched the happy people and did not feel envy, but wished that this family had all the turmoil in the past. After the guests had departed, Barbara trustingly snuggled up to her husband and confided to him, "You know, I think I'm ready for motherhood. Roger proved to me that children are the greatest happiness." The man did not change his wife's mind. Soon Barbara pleased him and Audrey with the news of her pregnancy. Exactly on time and without any complications, the woman gave birth to a daughter. The girl was named Sharon in honor of Matthew's army friend, and as a symbol of victory over the terrible memories of the past.